The stagecoach door swung open to reveal Clara Whitmore, 23, penniless, and carrying everything she owned in a single carpet bag. She'd traveled 2,000 miles to marry a stranger, expecting nothing but survival. Yet the man waiting at the Copper Creek depot wasn't what she'd imagined. Samuel Carter stood with his hat in his hands, offering not demands, but choices. "You don't have to decide today," he said quietly. What happened next changed everything. Stay with me as this story unfolds, and comment below which city you're watching from. I'd love to know how far our stories travel. The wheels of the stagecoach had barely stopped turning when Clara Whitmore felt her entire body seize with a terror so profound she couldn't breathe. Through the dust-caked window, she could see the outline of Copper Creek, a collection of weathered buildings that looked more like suggestions than actual structures, huddled against the endless Colorado sky. This was it, the end of the line, the place where she would either find salvation or discover she'd made the most catastrophic mistake of her life. "Ma'am?" The driver's gravelly voice cut through her paralysis. "This is your stop." Clara's fingers trembled as she gathered her carpet bag, a worn thing that had belonged to her mother, now holding the pitiful remnants of what had once been a respectable life in Boston. 3 dresses, 2 of them mended so many times the original fabric was barely visible. Her mother's Bible, a silver hairbrush that she should have sold but couldn't bear to part with, and tucked into the inner pocket, the letter that had brought her here, water-stained and read so many times the ink had begun to fade. Samuel Carter seeks companionable woman of good character for matrimony. Ranch life requires strength of spirit, board and necessities provided. Copper Creek, Colorado Territory. 43 words that had seemed like a lifeline when she'd discovered them in the Boston Herald 6 weeks ago. 43 words that now felt like a noose tightening around her throat. The other passengers had already disembarked, a traveling salesman who'd tried to engage her in conversation until her cold silence drove him away, and a severe-looking woman who'd spent the entire journey from Denver clutching her purse as if Clara might steal it. Now Clara was alone, and the driver was growing impatient. "Ma'am, I've got a schedule to keep." She forced herself to stand, her legs unsteady after 3 days of constant motion. The hem of her best dress, a deep blue wool that had once been fashionable, was gray with dust. She'd tried to clean herself up at the last way station, but there was only so much that could be done with a basin of lukewarm water and a sliver of lye soap. The October air hit her like a slap when she stepped down from the coach. It was thin and sharp, nothing like the thick, sea-tinged atmosphere of Boston. Here, the air seemed to have edges, cutting into her lungs with each breath. The sun was brutal despite the season's chill, and she had to squint against its glare. That's when she saw him. He stood apart from the small crowd that had gathered to meet the stage, and Clara knew instantly that this was Samuel Carter. Not because he matched the image she'd constructed in her mind. He didn't. She'd expected someone older, harder, marked by the obvious desperation that would drive a man to advertise for a bride. Instead, Samuel Carter was perhaps 35, tall and lean in the way of men who worked with their bodies rather than their minds. His face was weathered but not unkind, with deep-set gray eyes that seemed to take in everything without revealing anything. He held his hat in his hands, a gesture that struck her as oddly formal, almost courtly. He didn't rush forward, he waited. Clara felt the weight of the townspeople's stares. She could practically hear their thoughts. Another mail-order bride. Wonder how long this one will last. Her cheeks burned, but she lifted her chin and walked toward Samuel with what she hoped looked like confidence rather than the desperate bravado it actually was. "Miss Whitmore?" His voice was deep but gentle, like distant thunder. "Mr. Carter." Her own voice came out as barely a whisper. She cleared her throat and tried again. "Yes, I'm Clara Whitmore." He studied her for a moment, and she had the unsettling feeling he was seeing past the travel dust and exhaustion to something deeper. Then he did something that completely upended her expectations. He smiled. Not a large smile, just a slight upturn at the corners of his mouth, but it transformed his face entirely. "You must be tired," he said. "It's a hard journey from Boston." The unexpected kindness in his voice nearly undid her. She'd been prepared for immediate demands, for being whisked away to a church or a justice of the peace. She'd steeled herself for a quick, business-like transaction, her body and labor in exchange for food and shelter. This gentleness was something she hadn't armed herself against. "I'm fine," she lied. "No, you're not." He said it simply, without accusation. "And that's all right. There's a boarding house just down the street. Mrs. Hollowell runs a clean establishment. I've arranged a room for you." Clara blinked, certain she'd misheard. "A room?" "You need rest. A proper meal, time to think." He gestured to her carpet bag. "May I?" Numbly, she let him take it. His hands were calloused but careful, and she noticed he held her bag as if it contained something precious rather than the shabby belongings of a desperate woman. They walked through the town, Samuel slightly ahead, creating a path through the curious onlookers. Clara caught fragments of whispered conversations. "Pretty enough, I suppose. Bet she doesn't last the winter. Sam's a fool if he thinks a city girl can handle ranch life." Each comment was a small cut, but Clara had endured worse in Boston after her father's disgrace. At least here, the wounds were from strangers. Mrs. Hollowell's boarding house was a two-story structure that had seen better days but was obviously well-maintained. The proprietress herself was a sturdy woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and work-reddened hands. She took one look at Clara and made a tutting sound. "Lord have mercy, Samuel Carter. What were you thinking having her travel all this way alone?" "She made it, didn't she?" Samuel's voice held a note of something. Pride, respect. "Miss Whitmore, this is Mrs. Hollowell. She'll take good care of you." Mrs. Hollowell's expression softened slightly. "Come on then, dear. Let's get you settled." Clara started to follow, then turned back to Samuel. "Mr. Carter, I don't understand. I thought, that is, your letter indicated some urgency." "My letter indicated a need, Miss Whitmore, but a need that's waited this long can wait a few more days." He put his hat back on, tipping it slightly. "I'll call on you tomorrow afternoon if that's acceptable. We can talk then." "Talk?" "About what you're expecting, what I'm offering, whether either of those things align with what the other wants." He paused at the door. "Miss Whitmore, you came here of your own free will. I'd like you to stay the same way." And then he was gone, leaving Clara standing in the boarding house parlor with Mrs. Hollowell clucking around her like a concerned hen. The room Mrs. Hollowell showed her to was small but clean, with a brass bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out onto the main street. There was even a small bunch of wildflowers in a mason jar on the windowsill, black-eyed Susans, and something purple Clara didn't recognize. "Samuel brought those this morning," Mrs. Hollowell said, noticing Clara's gaze. "Said a room without flowers was just a box with a bed." Clara felt tears prick at her eyes. When was the last time anyone had thought to bring her flowers? Before Father's world collapsed, certainly. Before the scandal that had seen them turned out of their Beacon Hill home, their servants dismissed, their friends suddenly unavailable. Before the creditors had taken everything, even Mother's piano. Before Father had put that pistol to his temple rather than face prison, leaving Clara truly alone. "Now then," Mrs. Hollowell's voice became brisk. "There's hot water for a bath down the hall. Supper's at 6, nothing fancy, but it'll stick to your ribs. And there's no need to worry about payment. Samuel's taken care of everything." "For how long?" "For as long as you need." After Mrs. Hollowell left, Clara sat on the edge of the bed and tried to make sense of what was happening. This wasn't following the script she'd prepared for. She'd heard stories, of course, about mail-order brides. Some found happiness, but more often the tales were cautionary ones. Women trapped in loveless marriages to brutal men, isolated on remote homesteads with no escape. She'd accepted that possibility when she'd answered Samuel's advertisement. What choice did she have? The alternatives in Boston were the textile factory, where girls lost fingers to the machines and their hearing to the noise, or worse, the kind of establishment where women sold more than their labor. But Samuel Carter didn't seem brutal. He seemed careful, thoughtful, as if he understood that she was a person rather than a commodity he'd ordered from a catalog. The bath was heaven. Clara hadn't realized how much the dirt and sweat of travel had been weighing on her until she watched it swirl away down the drain. She washed her hair twice, luxuriating in the hot water, and stayed in until her fingers pruned and the water began to cool. Dinner was exactly as Mrs. Hollowell had promised. Nothing fancy, but plentiful and good. Beef stew with carrots and potatoes, fresh bread that was still warm from the oven, and apple pie that made Clara close her eyes with pleasure at the first bite. She ate alone in her room, not quite ready to face the other boarders, but she could hear their voices through the floor, laughter and argument, and the ordinary sounds of people living their lives. That night, lying in the unfamiliar bed, Clara stared at the ceiling and tried to imagine what tomorrow's conversation with Samuel would bring. What did she expect? Safety, security. A roof over her head that no creditor could snatch away. And what was she willing to give in return? Everything, she'd thought when she'd left Boston. Her body, her labor, her future children. Her freedom, essentially, in exchange for survival. But what if Samuel Carter was offering something different? What if he actually wanted a wife, rather than just a servant who shared his bed? The thought terrified her more than the alternative. She knew how to be useful. She'd learned that in the months after Father's death, taking in sewing, scrubbing floors, doing whatever was necessary to keep a roof over her head, until even that became impossible. But being wanted? Being chosen for herself rather than her utility? She didn't know how to do that anymore. Sleep, when it finally came, was restless and full of dreams where she was back on the stagecoach, traveling through an endless landscape toward a destination that kept receding no matter how far she went. The next morning brought a different Mrs. Hollowell, one determined to make Clara presentable, as she put it. "Not that you aren't already lovely, dear," she said, heating a curling iron on the stove, "but a little effort never hurt when it comes to important conversations." Clara submitted to the ministrations partly because she didn't have the energy to resist, and partly because it felt good to have someone care about her appearance. Mrs. Hollowell worked wonders with the curling iron, pinning Clara's dark hair up in a style that was both practical and flattering. She even produced a small pot of rouge, though Clara drew the line at that. "I won't have him think I'm trying to deceive him." Mrs. Hollowell snorted. "Honey, every woman deceives men a little. It's how we survive. The trick is knowing how much deception they can handle." Clara wanted to ask about Samuel, what kind of man he was, what had happened to his first wife if there had been one, why he'd resorted to advertising for a bride. But every time she opened her mouth to form the questions, something stopped her. Maybe she was afraid of the answers. Or maybe she wanted to form her own impressions without the filter of town gossip. Samuel arrived precisely at 2:00. Clara watched from her window as he walked up the street, his stride long and purposeful. He'd dressed up, or what passed for dressing up out here. Clean shirt, leather vest, his boots shined. He'd even shaved, revealing a strong jaw and a thin scar along his left cheek that she hadn't noticed yesterday. Mrs. Hollowell showed him into the parlor, then discreetly disappeared, though Clara was certain she was listening from the kitchen. Samuel stood when Clara entered, that same gesture of removing his hat that seemed to belong to another era. "Miss Whitmore, you look rested." "I am, thank you. And thank you for—" She gestured vaguely, encompassing the room, the bath, the meals. "No need for thanks. Coffee?" There was a pot and 2 cups on the side table. Clara nodded and Samuel poured, his movements surprisingly graceful for such large hands. They sat across from each other, the coffee providing something to do while they navigated the awkwardness. Finally, Samuel set down his cup and leaned back in his chair. "I suppose I should start by telling you why I placed that advertisement." Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. "I have a ranch about 3 miles outside town. 600 acres, 100 head of cattle, some horses. I've been building it up for 8 years, ever since I came out from Missouri." He paused, his gray eyes focusing on something beyond the parlor walls. "It's good land. Hard land, but good. The kind that gives back what you put into it, sometimes more." "You've done this alone?" "Had help here and there. Hired hands during roundup and branding, but essentially, yes, alone." He brought his gaze back to her. "I'm 36 years old, Miss Whitmore. I've built something I'm proud of. But lately, I've been asking myself what the point of it all is if there's no one to share it with, no one to leave it to." "Children," Clara said, understanding. "You want children." "Eventually, yes, but that's not—" He stood abruptly, pacing to the window. Can I be frank with you? I'd prefer it. I could have married half a dozen local girls over the years. Ranchers' daughters who know the life, know what it demands. But they also know me, or think they do. They see Samuel Carter, successful rancher. They see the land, the cattle, the house I've built. They don't see... He trailed off. What don't they see? He turned from the window, and for the first time Clara saw vulnerability in his expression. The man who reads books by lamplight until his eyes burn, who sometimes stands in the middle of his empty house and wonders if this is all there is. Who wants a partner, not just a wife? Someone who chose this life rather than being born into it. Clara's heart was pounding. And you think a desperate woman from Boston who answered your advertisement is that partner? I think a woman brave enough to travel 2,000 miles alone, leaving everything she's known behind, might be... He returned to his chair. Tell me why you came. Clara had prepared for this question, had crafted a response about seeking new opportunities, about the appeal of the frontier. But sitting here, with Samuel's honest gaze on her, she found herself telling the truth. My father was James Whitmore of Whitmore Shipping. Perhaps you've heard of it? Samuel shook his head. No, I suppose news of Boston financial scandals doesn't reach Colorado. He built the company from nothing, worked his way up from dock worker to owner of 12 ships. We were rich. Not Vanderbilt rich, but comfortable. More than comfortable. She stared into her coffee cup. Then he started gambling. Not cards or horses, investments. Risky ventures that promised enormous returns. And for a while they delivered. We moved to a bigger house. Mother had her own carriage. I had tutors and music lessons and gowns from Paris. What happened? What always happens when you build your life on speculation. The ventures failed. All of them, in quick succession. Father had been borrowing to cover his losses, using the ships as collateral. Within 3 months, we lost everything. The house, the ships, the servants, Mother's jewelry, my piano. Her voice caught on that last word. Mother died of pneumonia that winter. I think it was really shame that killed her. And Father took the coward's way out rather than face prison. Leaving you alone. Leaving me alone and tainted by scandal. No respectable family would employ me as a governess. The factories would take me, but... She shuddered. Have you ever seen what those machines do to the girls who work them? And the other option. You don't need to explain. So when I saw your advertisement, it seemed like a door opening when all others had slammed shut. I came here expecting nothing, Mr. Carter, or rather, expecting the worst and hoping for something bearable. And what have you found? Clara looked at him directly. I don't know yet. He smiled then, that small transformative expression. Good. That's honest. He stood. Miss Whitmore, here's what I propose. Spend a week here in town getting your strength back, then come out to the ranch. See the life I'm offering. Meet Jake. Jake? A boy I took in last year. His parents died of fever, and he had nowhere else to go. He's 10, smart as a whip, but wild as a Mustang. He needs... Samuel paused, choosing his words carefully. He needs someone who understands what it's like to lose everything. Clara felt something shift in her chest. You're already raising a child. I'm keeping him fed and sheltered. There's a difference between that and raising. I do my best, but the boy needs more than I know how to give. He moved toward the door, then turned back. Take the week, Miss Whitmore. Rest, think. Decide what you want. If you choose to come to the ranch, we'll have a trial period. Call it a courtship if that makes it more palatable. You'll have your own room, your own space. If after a month you decide this isn't the life you want, I'll pay your passage back to Boston or wherever else you'd like to go. And if I decide to stay, then we'll be married and we'll build something together. Not me offering you shelter in exchange for services, but two people choosing to face whatever comes as partners. Clara stood, her legs unsteady. Mr. Carter, Samuel, this isn't what I expected. I know. It's not what I expected either when I placed that advertisement. But meeting you, seeing your courage, he put on his hat. Take the week, Clara. I'll wait. After he left, Clara sank back into her chair, her mind reeling. She'd prepared herself for so many possibilities: brutality, indifference, desperate passion. But not this. Not respect and patience and the offer of choice. Mrs. Hollowell appeared in the doorway with suspicious promptness, carrying a fresh pot of coffee. "Well, will you be staying longer?" "It seems so. Mr. Carter has suggested a week." Smart man, Samuel, though not always wise. Mrs. Hollowell poured herself a cup and settled into the chair Samuel had vacated. "You want to know about him?" It wasn't a question. Clara nodded. "Came here 8 years ago with nothing but a horse, a saddle, and a determination that could move mountains. Worked for Tom Morrison first, learned the cattle business, saved every penny, lived like a monk. When the Baxter place came up for sale, owner died of snakebite, widow wanted to go back east, Samuel bought it with everything he had. No family, none that he speaks of. There are rumors, of course. Some say he was in the war, though he'd have been barely more than a boy. Others say there was a woman back in Missouri, maybe a child that died. But Samuel keeps his past locked up tighter than Fort Knox." Mrs. Hollowell studied Clara over her coffee cup. "He's a good man, though. Tough, but fair. Took in that boy Jake without hesitation when everyone else was wringing their hands about what to do with an orphan." "Why didn't he marry one of the local girls?" Mrs. Hollowell laughed. "Oh, they've tried. The Morrison girl practically threw herself at him last Christmas. But Samuel, he wants something more than a pretty face and childbearing hips. He reads, orders books from Denver, sometimes even Chicago. Has opinions about things that would scandalize half the town if he voiced them." Such as? Such as thinking women should have the right to vote. Such as teaching that boy Jake right alongside the Mexican Hands children, saying education shouldn't depend on the color of your skin or the language your parents speak. She leaned forward conspiratorially. "He even insisted on paying me the same rate he'd pay a man when I helped with his accounts last winter." Clara felt something loosen in her chest. "He sounds almost too good to be true." "Oh, he's got his flaws. Stubborn as a mule when he thinks he's right. Can go days without saying more than 10 words. And that ranch is his first love. Make no mistake about that. Any woman who marries Samuel Carter will have to share him with 600 acres of Colorado dirt." That evening, Clara wrote a letter to her only remaining friend in Boston, though she wouldn't mail it yet. She needed to put her thoughts in order, and writing to Margaret had always helped her do that. "Dear Margaret," she wrote, "I have arrived safely in Colorado, though safely seems a strange word for the emotional upheaval I'm experiencing. The man I've come to marry is nothing like I expected. He has given me a room in a boarding house and a week to decide if I want to proceed. Can you imagine? A mail-order bride being courted? I prepared myself for the worst, for degradation and desperation, and doing whatever was necessary to survive. Instead, I found a man who brings flowers to empty rooms and speaks of partnership rather than ownership. I'm terrified, Margaret, not of him, but of hope. Hope is so much more dangerous than resignation." She set down her pen and stared out the window at the darkening sky. Somewhere out there, 3 miles beyond the town limits, Samuel Carter was probably finishing his evening chores. Was he thinking of her? Was he regretting his offer of time and choice? Or was he simply going about his routine, confident that whatever happened was meant to be? The week passed more quickly than Clara had anticipated. She established a routine: breakfast with Mrs. Hollowell, walks through the town to build her strength, afternoons reading in the parlor. Mrs. Hollowell had a surprising collection of novels, and evenings helping with the mending in exchange for her extended stay, despite Mrs. Hollowell's protests that Samuel had paid enough. The townspeople grew accustomed to her presence. The initial curiosity faded into polite nods and occasional conversations. She met the owner of the general store, Mr. Patterson, who told her Samuel was his best customer. Always pays on time, never haggles unfairly. She met the school teacher, Miss Evans, a young woman from Ohio who'd come west for adventure and found herself teaching 23 children in a one-room schoolhouse. She even met some of the other ranchers' wives, sturdy women who eyed her city-soft hands with skepticism but grudging respect when they learned she hadn't immediately married Samuel upon arrival. "Smart of him to let you see what you're getting into," said Mrs. Morrison, whose husband owned the neighboring ranch. "Though I still say he should have married my Jennifer." She knows ranch life. Clara had seen Jennifer Morrison, a pretty blonde girl of maybe 20 who looked at Samuel with naked longing whenever their paths crossed. She couldn't blame the girl. As the week progressed and Clara observed Samuel's interactions with the townspeople, she saw a man who was universally respected, even if not entirely understood. He was fair in his dealings, quick to help when needed, but maintained a reserve that kept people at arm's length. He came to see her twice more during that week, once to bring a book, Jane Eyre, which made her laugh. Is this meant to be a warning about difficult men and the women who choose them? It's meant to be a good story. Mrs. Hollowell mentioned you like to read. The second time, he brought Jake. The boy was exactly as Samuel had described, wild as a Mustang. He had sun-bleached hair that stuck up at all angles, clothes that were clean but patched, and eyes that held too much knowledge for a 10-year-old. He regarded Clara with deep suspicion. "You're the lady from Boston," he said, as if Boston were another planet. "I am. And you're Jake. Samuel says you might come live at the ranch." "I might." "Can you cook?" "Reasonably well." "Can you ride?" "No." "Can you shoot?" "No." Jake looked at Samuel with exasperation. "What good is she then?" "Jake!" Samuel's voice held a warning, but Clara laughed. "Those are fair questions. I can't ride or shoot, but I can read and write and do arithmetic. I can sew and mend. I can teach you about places beyond Colorado, about ships and oceans and cities with buildings so tall you can't see their tops. And I can learn. If I come to the ranch, will you teach me to ride?" Jake studied her for a long moment. "Maybe. If you're not too scared." "I'm terrified," Clara admitted, "but I've learned that being scared doesn't mean you don't do something." Something shifted in Jake's expression, a recognition, perhaps, of a fellow survivor. "I guess you could come," he said grudgingly. "The house is too quiet anyway." That night, Clara made her decision. Not because of Samuel's kindness or the security he offered or even the surprising charm of young Jake. She made it because she realized that for the first time since her father's death, she was thinking about the future instead of just surviving the present. When Samuel had spoken of partnership, of building something together, she'd felt a stirring of possibility that she'd thought had died with her old life. The next morning, she found Samuel at the general store loading supplies into his wagon. He looked up when she approached, and she saw hope flicker in his gray eyes. "I've decided," she said without preamble. "I'd like to come to the ranch." His smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "When?" "Today, if that suits you." "It suits me fine." And so, exactly 1 week after arriving in Copper Creek expecting to be married within hours, Clara found herself sitting beside Samuel Carter on a wagon seat, her carpet bag in the back along with sacks of flour and coffee and a bolt of calico that Samuel had impulsively purchased in case you want to make curtains or something. The road to the ranch was rough, little more than 2 ruts carved into the prairie by countless passages of wagons. But the landscape was breathtaking in its austere beauty. The grass rippled like a golden ocean under the October wind, and the mountains rose in the distance, their peaks already white with early snow. Hawks circled overhead, and once Clara saw a group of antelope bounding across a distant ridge. "It's so empty," she said, then worried he'd take it as criticism. "I mean, so open." "It is that. Took me a while to get used to it after Missouri, but now I can't imagine living anywhere else. The space gets into your bones." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the creak of the wagon and the steady clop of the horses' hooves providing a rhythmic soundtrack. Clara found herself stealing glances at Samuel's profile, trying to read the man she was choosing to bind her life to. He had a way of scanning the horizon constantly, even while talking, as if checking for threats or changes in weather. "Tell me about Jake," she said eventually. "How did he come to be with you?" Samuel's jaw tightened slightly. "The Hendersons had a small place about 10 miles north. Good people, just trying to make a go of it. Fever hit last summer, lots of folks got sick. The Hendersons didn't make it. Jake was sick too, but he pulled through. Had an aunt back in Kentucky who was supposed to take him, but she never answered the telegram, so I took him in." "Just like that?" "What else was there to do? Boy needed a home. I had room." He glanced at her. "Don't make me out to be some kind of saint, Clara." "I'm not. Jake earns his keep. He helps with chores, tends the chickens, helps with the horses, and having him around, it makes the place less empty. As they crested a rise, Samuel pulled the horses to a stop. There it is. Clara's first view of what would become her home took her breath away. The house sat in a natural bowl of land, sheltered from the worst of the winds by a ridge to the north. It was larger than she'd expected, a two-story structure of logs and milled lumber with a wide porch wrapping around two sides. There were outbuildings scattered around, a barn, what looked like a bunkhouse, various sheds and corrals. A kitchen garden, now mostly harvested, lay to the south of the house. And everywhere, as far as she could see, was Samuel's land, rippling away toward the mountains. You built all this? Most of it. Had help with the barn. You need more than one pair of hands for that. But the house, yes, room by room, year by year. He clicked to the horses, and they started down toward the ranch. It's not fancy. It's perfect, Clara said, and meant it. After the ornate excess of her childhood home, then the cramped boarding houses of her decline. This solid, purposeful structure felt like exactly what she needed. Jake came running from the barn as they pulled up, his face a mixture of excitement and wariness. You came! I said I would. Clara accepted Samuel's hand to help her down from the wagon. Now, are you going to show me around, or do I have to explore on my own? The house tour, conducted primarily by Jake with Samuel adding occasional comments, revealed a home that was indeed not fancy, but was well built and carefully maintained. The main floor had a large kitchen with a proper stove, a luxury out here, Samuel noted, a dining room that looked rarely used, a parlor with furniture that seemed chosen for durability rather than style, and what Samuel called his office, a small room lined with shelves that held not just ledgers but books. So many books. Clara ran her fingers along the spines. Shakespeare, Dickens, Thoreau, even Mary Shelley. There were agricultural journals, newspapers from Denver, and what looked like a collection of poetry. You weren't exaggerating about the reading, she said. Samuel looked almost embarrassed. Winter nights are long. A man needs something to occupy his mind. Upstairs were 3 bedrooms, Samuel's, Jake's, and what would be Clara's. Her room was at the end of the hall, with windows facing both east and south. It was simply furnished with a bed, dresser, and washstand, but everything was clean and well made. Someone, Samuel, had put a quilt on the bed that looked handmade, its pattern a wedding ring design in blues and yellows. This was meant to be, Samuel started, then stopped. It's yours for as long as you want it. That evening, Clara cooked her first meal in her potential future home. It wasn't elaborate. Fried chicken, potatoes, green beans that Mrs. Hollowell had sent along, and biscuits that didn't quite rise properly in the unfamiliar oven. But sitting at the large kitchen table, the dining room was too formal, they all agreed, watching Jake devour everything in sight while Samuel ate with quiet appreciation, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced since before her world fell apart, the possibility of belonging. After dinner, Jake was sent to finish his chores, and Clara found herself alone with Samuel on the porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains. The temperature had dropped rapidly once the sun began its descent, and Clara shivered despite her shawl. You'll need warmer clothes, Samuel observed. Winter here isn't like Boston winter. It's... He searched for words. More honest. No buildings to block the wind, no crowds to share the cold with, just you and the elements. Are you trying to scare me off? No. Just want you to know what you're choosing. He was quiet for a moment. Clara, can I ask you something? What do you want from marriage? Not what you'll settle for, but what you actually want. The question caught her off guard. No one had ever asked her that before. Her parents had assumed she'd marry well, meaning wealthy. After their fall, she'd assumed she'd never marry at all. And when she'd answered Samuel's advertisement, she'd thought only of survival. I want, she began, then stopped, gathering her thoughts. I want to matter to someone, not just be useful or decorative or convenient, but actually matter. I want to build something that lasts. I want to wake up in the morning with purpose beyond just getting through the day. And I want... She hesitated, then forged ahead. I want to be chosen, not because I'm the only option, but because someone decided I was worth choosing. Samuel turned to look at her fully, and in the dying light, his eyes seemed to hold depths she hadn't noticed before. And what about love? Love? Clara laughed, but it wasn't bitter. I'm 23 years old, Samuel. I've seen what passes for love in Boston society. Strategic alliances dressed up in romance. I've seen what my parents called love turn to resentment when the money ran out. I don't know if I believe in love anymore. But you believe in partnership. Yes, partnership I can understand. Two people working toward common goals, supporting each other, building something together. That seems real to me in a way that love doesn't. Samuel stood and walked to the porch railing, looking out at his land. My parents loved each other. Truly loved each other. They had nothing, a small farm in Missouri that barely fed us. But they had each other. When my mother died of consumption, my father just gave up. Died 6 months later. Doctor said it was his heart, but I knew better. He died of missing her. That sounds beautiful and terrible at the same time. It was both. He turned back to her. I'm not asking you to love me, Clara. Not now, maybe not ever, but I'm asking you to try. To be open to the possibility that two people who choose each other for practical reasons might find something more. Clara stood and moved beside him at the railing. The first stars were appearing in the darkening sky, more stars than she'd ever seen in Boston. I can try. But Samuel, what if I disappoint you? What if I can't be the ranch wife you need? Then we'll figure out what kind of wife you can be. He smiled slightly. Clara, I didn't advertise for a ranch wife. I advertised for a partner. There's a difference. That night, lying in the unfamiliar bed in the room that might become hers permanently, Clara listened to the night sounds of the ranch, the distant lowing of cattle, the neigh of a horse, the creak of the house settling, Jake's occasional cough from down the hall. It was so different from the nighttime symphony of Boston. No carriages on cobblestones, no drunken singing from the taverns, no foghorns from the harbor. She thought about Samuel's question about love and her own answer. Had she been honest? Or had she been protecting herself, building walls against disappointment? When Samuel had smiled at her that first day at the stage depot, something had stirred in her chest that had nothing to do with gratitude or relief. When he'd brought flowers for an empty room, when he'd offered her time and choice, when he'd stood beside her on the porch, talking about his parents' love, each moment had added a stone to a foundation she hadn't realized was being built. The next days fell into a rhythm that felt both foreign and natural. Clara woke before dawn, dressed in the practical work dress Mrs. Hollowell had insisted she take, and made breakfast for the household. Samuel was always up first, already out tending to the animals by the time Clara started the coffee. Jake stumbled down later, hair askew, complaining about the early hour but devouring everything Clara put in front of him. After breakfast, Samuel would head out to work the ranch, checking fences, moving cattle, tending to sick animals, the 1,000 tasks that kept the place running. Jake went with him when he wasn't at school, 3 days a week in town, a concession Samuel had fought for and won. Clara kept house, a job that was both harder and simpler than she'd expected. Harder because everything required more physical effort than she was used to. Water had to be pumped and heated. The stove required constant feeding with wood that she had to split herself when Jake forgot. Laundry was a back-breaking full-day affair that left her hands raw. But simpler because there were no social calls to manage, no elaborate meals for judgmental guests, no maintaining appearances that her family couldn't afford. In the afternoons, when her housework was done, Clara explored the ranch. She learned the names of the horses, discovered a family of barn cats that Jake secretly fed, found a spot by the creek where wildflowers still bloomed despite the lateness of the season. And slowly, carefully, she began to know Samuel. He was a man of routines and quiet gestures. Every morning, he left a bucket of fresh water by her door so she wouldn't have to pump it first thing. Every evening, he checked that she had enough wood for her stove. When he went to town, he always brought back something small, a newspaper, a handful of penny candy for Jake, once a small mirror for her room that he presented with awkward embarrassment. Thought you might like, women need such things, don't they? But it was in the evenings, after Jake had gone to bed, that Clara felt she saw the real Samuel. They would sit in the parlor, him with his ledgers or a book, her with her sewing, and talk. Or not talk. Sometimes the silence was just as comfortable. He told her about the ranch, his plans to expand the herd, maybe add sheep despite the cattleman's scorn for woolies. She told him about Boston, about the ships her father had owned, about the piano she'd loved and lost. "Would you like another piano?" he asked one evening, looking up from his accounts. "Samuel, pianos cost a fortune, especially out here." "That's not what I asked." She considered. "Someday, maybe. When the ranch is doing well enough that it wouldn't be a hardship." "We're doing well enough now." "Then when I've earned it. When I've proven I can be what you need." He set down his pen and looked at her directly. "Clara, you don't have to earn anything. You're not an employee." "I'm not your wife either." "Not yet." "No," he agreed. "But you're becoming something. To Jake. To this place. To me." The way he said it, quiet and certain, made her chest tighten with an emotion she wasn't ready to name. The first snowfall came 3 weeks after Clara's arrival at the ranch, transforming the landscape into something from a fairy tale. She stood at the kitchen window, mesmerized by the fat flakes drifting down, when Jake burst through the door, his face flushed with cold and excitement. "Samuel says we need to bring the cattle down from the north pasture," he announced, stomping snow from his boots. "Says there's a real storm coming behind this pretty stuff." Clara had learned to trust Samuel's weather instincts. He could read the sky like other men read newspapers, sensing changes in pressure and wind that foretold what was coming. She quickly packed food, biscuits, dried meat, apples, knowing they might be out there for hours. "I'm coming with you," she said, reaching for her heaviest shawl. Jake looked scandalized. "You can't help with cattle. You don't even know how to ride proper yet." "Then I'll learn by doing." She'd been taking riding lessons from Jake, practicing on Buttercup, the gentlest mare in Samuel's string. She could manage a walk and a trot, though galloping still terrified her. Samuel appeared in the doorway, snow dusting his shoulders. His eyes found Clara immediately. "You sure about this? You need every hand you can get, don't you?" He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Jake, saddle Buttercup for Miss Clara, and find her my old slicker. It'll swim on her, but it's better than nothing." The work was harder than anything Clara had ever done. They spent hours in the biting wind, driving stubborn cattle down from the higher ground. Clara's job was simple: stay mounted and block any animals that tried to break away from the herd. But simple didn't mean easy. Her hands went numb inside her gloves, her face stung from the wind-driven snow, and her legs ached from gripping Buttercup's sides. But she didn't quit. Not when one ornery steer charged her position and Buttercup danced sideways, nearly unseating her. Not when the snow turned from pretty flakes to stinging pellets. Not when she could no longer feel her feet in the stirrups. "You're doing fine," Samuel called to her at one point, materializing out of the white blur beside her. "Just a bit more. Can you manage?" She nodded, not trusting her voice, but something warm bloomed in her chest at the approval in his eyes. They got the cattle into the near pasture just as the real storm hit. The wind went from strong to vicious, driving snow horizontally across the land. Samuel grabbed Buttercup's reins, leading both horse and rider toward the barn, his body shielding them from the worst of the wind. Inside the barn's relative warmth, Clara slid from the saddle and nearly collapsed. Her legs wouldn't hold her. Samuel caught her, his arms strong and steady around her. "I'm sorry," she gasped. "I just need a moment." "Don't apologize." His voice was rough. "You did the work of a seasoned hand today. I'm proud of you." She looked up at him, and for a moment the world narrowed to just the two of them in the lamp-lit barn, snow howling outside, his arms around her. Something shifted in his expression, a softening that made her heart race. He started to lean toward her, then caught himself, stepping back. "We should get to the house," he said. "Jake will have started dinner." But the moment lingered between them, unspoken but undeniable. The storm lasted 3 days, trapping them in the house. Clara had expected to feel confined, but instead she felt cocooned. They played cards by lamplight, Jake teaching her poker with beans for chips. Samuel read aloud from David Copperfield while Clara mended clothes, and Jake whittled a piece of wood into something that might have been a horse. They made taffy one afternoon, pulling the candy until their arms ached, Jake getting it everywhere and laughing harder than Clara had ever heard him. On the second night of the storm, Clara couldn't sleep. The wind was making sounds like voices, like her father calling her name. She wrapped herself in a blanket and crept downstairs, not wanting to wake anyone. Samuel was in the parlor, standing at the window watching the snow. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked without turning. "The wind. It sounds like ghosts," he finished. "I know. First winter here, I thought I'd go mad from it." She moved to stand beside him. Outside was nothing but white chaos, the familiar landscape erased. "Doesn't it frighten you? Being so isolated?" "Sometimes. But isolation's not the same as loneliness." He glanced at her. "I was lonelier in Missouri, surrounded by people, than I've ever been here." "Why did you leave?" He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "There was a woman, Elizabeth. We were going to be married. Had everything planned, the church, the house we'd live in, the children we'd have. 2 weeks before the wedding, she told me she'd fallen in love with my brother." Clara's breath caught. "Oh, Samuel." "They were sorry," they said. "Couldn't help how they felt. Hoped I'd understand." His laugh was bitter. "I understood that I couldn't stay. Couldn't watch them build the life I'd thought would be mine. So I headed west. Kept going until I found a place where no one knew my name or my failures." Without thinking, Clara reached for his hand. His fingers were warm, calloused, and after a moment's hesitation, they closed around hers. "She was a fool," Clara said quietly. "No, she was honest. She chose love over convenience, passion over stability. I couldn't fault her for that, even as it broke me. And now," he turned to look at her fully, "now I think maybe she did me a favor. Led me here, to this land, to this life." His voice dropped. "To you." Clara's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. "Samuel, I know we agreed to a trial period, a month to decide. But Clara, I already know. I knew the moment you stepped off that stage looking terrified but determined. I knew when you stood up to Jake's questions. I knew when you rode out into a storm because the work needed doing." He raised their joined hands, pressing her knuckles to his lips. "I'm not asking you to decide tonight, but I'm asking you to know that I've already chosen. You're not just becoming something to this place. You've already become everything." Before she could respond, Jake's voice called from upstairs. "Samuel? Miss Clara? There's something wrong with one of the horses." They rushed to the barn, finding Jake with Dancer, one of the younger horses. The animal was down, breathing hard, clearly in distress. "Colic," Samuel said grimly. "Must have gotten into the bad hay." Clara had learned enough to know colic could kill a horse. Samuel immediately began working, trying to get the horse up, walking him when he stood, preventing him from rolling and twisting his intestines. Clara and Jake took turns when Samuel needed rest, walking the suffering animal in circles through the long, cold night. By dawn, Dancer was improving. Exhausted, the three of them sat in the hay, watching the horse drink water. A good sign. "We make a good team," Jake said sleepily, leaning against Clara's shoulder. "We do," Samuel agreed, his eyes on Clara. As the weeks passed and October became November, Clara found herself no longer thinking of the arrangement as temporary. She caught herself planning for spring, where she'd expand the garden, what she'd plant. She helped Samuel with the account books, her education proving useful as she caught calculation errors and suggested more efficient record-keeping methods. She taught Jake history and geography in the evenings, using Samuel's books and her own memories of the places she'd read about. One evening, as she was putting Jake to bed, he grabbed her hand. "Miss Clara? Are you going to stay?" She smoothed his unruly hair. "Do you want me to? Samuel needs you. He smiles more now, and he doesn't stand at the window looking sad when he thinks no one's watching." "What about you? Do you need me?" Jake squirmed, uncomfortable with emotional admissions. "Maybe. A little. The biscuits are better now." She laughed and kissed his forehead, something she'd only recently dared to do. "Your biscuits were terrible." "They were awful," he agreed, grinning. "Samuel was too polite to say so, but I saw him feeding them to the dogs." That night, Clara found Samuel in his office, working on correspondence. She knocked on the doorframe. "Come in." He looked up and his face brightened in a way that made her stomach flutter. Everything all right? Jake asked if I was staying. Samuel set down his pen carefully. What did you tell him? Nothing definite. I wanted to talk to you first. She entered the room, closing the door behind her. It's been almost a month. 26 days, he said quietly. Not that I'm counting. Samuel, She took a breath, gathering courage. In Boston, I had a life planned out. Marriage to someone of my father's choosing, children, social calls, charity work, a life lived in the margins of someone else's story. Then I lost everything and thought my life was over. But coming here, meeting you and Jake, working this land, I found something I never knew I was looking for. He stood, moving toward her slowly, as if afraid sudden movement might spook her. What have you found? A place where I matter, where what I do makes a real difference, where I'm not just decorative or useful, but necessary. She met his eyes, and a man who sees me as a whole person, not just the roles I can fill. Clara. Her name was barely a whisper. Are you saying... I'm saying my trial period is over. I choose this. I choose Jake. She stepped closer to him. I choose you. The kiss was inevitable, as natural as breathing. His hands cupped her face gently, reverently, as if she were something precious. The kiss was tender, questioning, and when she responded, pressing closer, she felt him smile against her lips. We should be married soon, he said when they parted, before the real winter sets in. Don't want to risk getting snowed in before it's official. How romantic, she teased, but she was smiling too. Clara. He grew serious. I need you to know something. I may not be good at saying the words. I wasn't raised to speak about feelings, but what I feel for you. He struggled, then simply said, it's more than partnership, more than convenience or companionship. It's... I know, she said softly. I feel it too. The wedding was set for the following Saturday. Word spread quickly through Copper Creek, and Clara was surprised by how many people seemed genuinely pleased. Mrs. Hollowell insisted on making Clara's dress, a practical but pretty creation in soft gray wool with pearl buttons that had belonged to her own mother. The ranch wives descended with advice, recipes, and knowing looks. Samuel's a good man, Mrs. Morrison said, having apparently forgiven Clara for not being her Jennifer. But ranch life will test you. The isolation, the hard work, the uncertainty of weather and markets. You sure you're ready? Clara thought of the storm, of working cattle in the snow, of walking a colicking horse through the night. I'm learning to be. Miss Evans, the schoolteacher, was more direct. You love him? The question would have seemed presumptuous a month ago. Now Clara answered without hesitation. Yes. And he loves you? Clara thought of all the quiet ways Samuel showed his feelings. The water by her door, the books he'd started leaving on her chair, the way his eyes found her first whenever he entered a room. Yes. Then you'll be fine. Love doesn't make the hard times easier, but it makes them worth enduring. The night before the wedding, Clara couldn't settle. She wandered the house, touching things that would officially be hers tomorrow. The kitchen table where they ate their meals, the parlor chairs where they spent their evenings, the books she'd already begun thinking of as theirs rather than his. She found herself at Samuel's office door. He was there, as she'd known he would be, not working but standing at the window. Their reflections caught in the glass, overlapping like a prophecy. Second thoughts? He asked. No, you. Never. He turned to her. Clara, there's something I should tell you. About the house, the land, I've had papers drawn up. If something happens to me, everything goes to you. Not held in trust, not with conditions. Yours outright. She was stunned. Samuel, the law doesn't usually. Colorado territory is different. And I want you to know that this isn't just about me gaining a wife. It's about you gaining a future that no one can take away. The gesture broke something open in her chest. In Boston, even before the scandal, she would have been property passed from father to husband. Here, Samuel was offering her not just partnership, but independence. Nothing's going to happen to you, she said fiercely. No, he agreed, but just in case. I've seen too many widows left with nothing. That won't be you. She crossed to him, taking his hands. Do you know when I knew I loved you? His eyes widened at the word, said so plainly. It wasn't any grand gesture, she continued. It was the first morning here when I came down to find you'd already stoked the kitchen stove so it would be warm when I woke. Such a small thing, but it told me everything about the kind of man you are. Clara, He stopped, struggling. The words don't come easy. Then don't say them. Show me. The kiss was different this time, deeper, full of promise and barely restrained passion. When it ended, they were both breathing hard. Tomorrow, he said roughly. After tomorrow, you'll be my wife. I already am, she said. Tomorrow just makes it legal. The wedding day dawned clear and cold, the sky a brilliant blue that seemed to go on forever. Clara stood in her room for only a few more hours, letting Mrs. Hollowell fuss with her hair. Jake had brought her wildflowers, somehow preserved from before the frost, and she carried them with hands that trembled only slightly. The ceremony was in the town's small church, packed with what seemed like everyone in 50 miles. Samuel stood at the altar in his best suit, looking uncomfortable with the formality, but his eyes warm when they found hers. Jake stood beside him as his best man, trying to look solemn but grinning irrepressibly. Reverend Mitchell kept the ceremony simple, as requested, but when he reached the vows, Samuel surprised everyone by speaking beyond the traditional words. Clara, he said, his voice carrying through the church, you came here expecting nothing and gave everything. You've brought light to a house that was just walls and a roof. You've given a boy who lost everything a chance at family again, and you've shown a man who thought he knew what he wanted that what he needed was something entirely different, someone who challenges him, supports him, and makes him want to be better than he is. I promise to honor you, protect you, and spend my life trying to deserve the gift of your choice. Clara was crying, not caring who saw. When it was her turn, she matched his honesty. Samuel, you offered me shelter when I expected demands, time when I expected rush, choice when I expected commands. You showed me that strength can be gentle, that silence can be companionship, that love can grow from respect and kindness rather than passion and desperation. I promise to stand beside you through whatever comes, storms and sunshine, abundance and want, joy and sorrow. I choose you, today and always. When Reverend Mitchell pronounced them married and Samuel kissed her, the entire church erupted in celebration. Even the men who usually maintained stoic reserve were smiling. The reception was at the ranch, the house overflowing with neighbors who'd brought food, music, and genuine warmth. Clara was surprised to find she knew everyone's names, their stories, their connections to Samuel and the ranch. Somewhere in the past month, without realizing it, she'd become part of the community. As the sun set, painting the mountains pink and gold, the guests began to leave. Jake was spending the night at the Morrisons, giving the newlyweds privacy. The house felt different with just the two of them, charged with possibility and nervous anticipation. Samuel found her on the porch, wrapped in her shawl, watching the last light fade. No regrets? He asked, joining her. None. You? Only that I didn't find you sooner. She turned to him, and in his eyes she saw her future. Not the one she'd planned in Boston, not the desperate escape she'd sought when she answered his advertisement, but something richer and truer than either. We found each other when we were meant to, she said. When we were ready. He pulled her close, and she rested her head against his chest, listening to his heartbeat, steady, strong, hers. Mrs. Carter, he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. Welcome home. That night, in the bed they now shared, Clara discovered that Samuel's careful courtesy extended to this as well. He was gentle, patient, attentive to her inexperience and her needs. When she woke in the early hours, his arm around her waist, she marveled at how different her life had become. 6 weeks ago, she'd been alone, desperate, with nothing but a carpetbag and fading hope. Now she had a husband, a son, for that's what Jake was becoming, a home, and a purpose. But more than that, she had love. Not the desperate, dramatic love of novels, but something deeper, love built on respect, kindness, shared work, and the choice to face whatever came together. Winter arrived in earnest the week after the wedding. The snow that had threatened during their wedding celebration finally fell, blanketing the ranch in white that would remain until spring. Clara learned the rhythm of winter ranch life, the constant checking of animals, breaking ice on water troughs, carefully rationing feed, watching for signs of sickness or distress in the herd. She also learned the intimacy of isolation. With travel to town difficult and dangerous, they were truly alone together for the first time. Samuel taught her to shoot, setting up targets behind the barn, patiently correcting her stance and aim until she could hit what she aimed at more often than not. "Why is this so important to you?" she asked after a particularly good session. "Because I can't always be here," he said simply, "and I need to know you can protect yourself and Jake, if necessary." The thought of him not being there chilled her more than the winter wind, but she understood the practicality. This was not Boston, where danger meant social embarrassment or financial ruin. Here, danger could be a rabid wolf, a desperate drifter, an accident with no help for miles. Jake thrived under their combined attention. His reading improved dramatically with Clara's tutoring, and Samuel began teaching him the more complex aspects of ranching, reading the weather, understanding cattle behavior, planning for seasons ahead. Watching them work together, Clara saw the future taking shape, Jake growing into a man who would help run this land, maybe take it over someday. One evening in December, as snow fell steadily outside, Jake looked up from his schoolwork. "Miss Clara, Ma." He stopped, flushing red. Clara's heart stopped. They'd never discussed what he should call her, and she hadn't wanted to pressure him. "Is that all right?" he asked anxiously. "Calling you Ma?" "It's more than all right," she managed through the lump in her throat. "It's perfect." Samuel reached over and squeezed her hand under the table, and she saw his eyes were suspiciously bright. That night, as they lay in bed listening to the wind howl, Samuel said, "You've given him something I couldn't." "What's that?" "Permission to have a family again. He was so afraid of forgetting his parents, betraying them somehow by caring for someone else. But you've shown him that love multiplies, it doesn't divide." "He's given me something too," Clara said. "A chance to be a mother without having to wait for—" She trailed off, suddenly embarrassed. "For children of our own?" Samuel pulled her closer. "They'll come, Clara. When they're meant to." And in the darkness, warm in their bed while winter raged outside, Clara believed him. Everything else had happened when it was meant to. Her arrival, their meeting, their love. Why should this be different? Christmas approached and Clara threw herself into preparations with an enthusiasm that amused Samuel and delighted Jake. She made cookies from Mrs. Hollowell's recipes, decorated the house with evergreen boughs and ribbons made from the calico Samuel had bought that first day. She conspired with Jake to make Samuel a new muffler, teaching the boy to knit in secret sessions while Samuel was out. "My fingers don't work right," Jake complained, fumbling with the needles. "Neither did mine at first." "But Samuel needs a new muffler, doesn't he? And it means more because we made it." Samuel, meanwhile, was working on his own secrets in the barn. Clara could hear hammering and sawing at odd hours, and his clothes often had sawdust despite his attempts to brush it off. On Christmas Eve, they attended church in town, making the treacherous journey because it mattered to be part of the community celebration. The service was simple but moving, and when they sang Silent Night, Clara found herself crying again. Not from sadness, but from overwhelming gratitude. A year ago, she'd been in Boston, her father recently dead, selling their remaining possessions to pay for food and rent. She'd spent Christmas Day alone, eating bread and cheese in a cold room, wondering if she'd survive the winter. Now she stood between her husband and son, in a church full of people who knew her name and were glad she was there. After the service, Mrs. Hollowell pressed a package into Clara's hands. "For the house," she said gruffly, clearly uncomfortable with sentiment. It was curtains for the parlor, beautifully made with fine stitching. "Oh, Mrs. Hollowell, they're lovely." "Well, a house needs proper curtains, makes it a home." The ride back to the ranch was magical, the moon bright on the snow, the stars like diamonds scattered across velvet. Jake fell asleep against Clara's shoulder, and Samuel drove with one arm around them both, keeping them warm and safe. Christmas morning brought revelations. Jake gave Samuel the muffler, lumpy and uneven but made with love. Samuel wore it immediately, declaring it the finest he'd ever owned. Clara gave Samuel a ledger she'd made with a new system for tracking the ranch's accounts that would make taxes and planning easier. When did you, he stammered. I have my ways, she said, pleased by his obvious delight. Then Samuel led them to the barn, where his secret was revealed, a beautiful rocking chair, hand-carved with flowers and vines along the back and arms. For the parlor, he said to Clara, for when you want to read. Or for. He paused, color rising in his cheeks. For later, when you might need to rock a baby. Clara threw her arms around him, not caring that Jake was watching and making exaggerated gagging sounds. But the biggest surprise was for Jake. Samuel had been corresponding with authorities in Kentucky, and he'd received word that Jake's aunt had been located. She'd never received the telegrams about Jake's parents, having moved without leaving a forwarding address. When she learned of Jake's situation, she'd immediately written back. She says she's glad I'm with good people, Jake read from the letter, his voice shaking slightly. She says if I'm happy and you want me, I should stay. She says she'll write and maybe visit someday, but she knows I'm where I belong. So you're ours, Clara said, pulling him into a hug. Officially ours. If you want me, Jake said, suddenly uncertain. Forever, Samuel said firmly. You're a Carter now, if you want to be. Jake nodded, unable to speak, and they stood there in the barn, a family forged not by blood, but by choice and love, and the courage to reach for happiness despite loss and fear. That evening, as snow began to fall again, they sat in the parlor, Clara in her new rocking chair, Samuel in his usual spot, Jake on the floor by the fire working on a new carving. The clock ticked, the fire crackled, and the wind sang around the corners of the house. It was a simple moment, unremarkable in most ways, but Clara knew she would remember it forever as the moment she understood what home truly meant. The new year arrived with a blizzard that trapped them inside for nearly a week. Clara had thought she understood winter from her years in Boston, but this was something entirely different. The snow piled so high it covered the first-floor windows, and the wind screamed like a living thing trying to tear the house apart. Samuel and Jake took turns digging tunnels to the barn to care for the animals, returning with ice in their beards and exhaustion in their eyes. We're losing cattle, Samuel said on the fourth night, his voice heavy with defeat. Found 3 frozen in the north pasture. Couldn't get them to shelter in time. Clara served him hot soup, watching the weight of responsibility bow his shoulders. Each lost animal meant less income come spring, less security for their future. She'd learned enough about ranch economics to understand that a bad winter could destroy years of careful building. We'll make it through, she said, rubbing his shoulders as he ate. We have enough preserved food, enough wood. The house is sound. It's not us I'm worried about. He caught her hand, pressing it to his cheek. It's the future. What I'm building for you, for Jake, every dead cow is a step backward. That night, she held him as he struggled with the burden of provision, understanding for the first time the true weight he carried. In Boston, when her father's fortunes failed, they'd simply had less. Here, failure meant survival itself was at stake. When the storm finally broke, they emerged to find a transformed world. The landscape was alien, familiar landmarks erased by snow that had drifted into fantastic shapes. The silence after so many days of wind was almost oppressive. They spent days digging out, creating paths between buildings, checking on animals, counting losses. The final tally was grim. 7 cattle dead, twice that many weakened and unlikely to survive if another storm hit. Samuel stood in the barn, staring at the depleted herd, his jaw tight with frustration. I should have brought them all in sooner. Should have read the signs better. You can't control the weather, Samuel, Clara said gently. No, but I should be able to protect what's mine. He turned to her, and she saw fear in his eyes for the first time. What's ours? Clara, if we lose too many more, then we start over, she interrupted. We rebuild. Together. Jake appeared in the barn doorway, his young face serious. Mr. Morrison's here. Says he needs to talk to you. Morrison's news was mixed. He'd lost cattle too, but he'd heard from other ranchers who'd been hit worse. The Baxter Ranch to the east had lost nearly half their herd. 2 families farther north had given up entirely, abandoning their claims to head back east. There's going to be opportunities come spring, Morrison said carefully. Land available cheap, cattle too from those who can't afford to keep them through the rest of winter. If a man had capital— I don't, Samuel said flatly. Everything's tied up in the ranch. Morrison shifted uncomfortably. Tom, my eldest, he's sweet on the Baker girl. They want to marry come spring. I'd been planning to give them the south section, but if you were interested in leasing it, maybe running your cattle with mine— Clara saw Samuel's pride war with practicality. Joining operations, even temporarily, felt like failure to him, but it might be the only way to survive. I need to think about it, Samuel said finally. That evening, as Clara worked on mending clothes and Samuel stared into the fire, she made a decision. She went to their bedroom and retrieved something she'd hidden beneath her underthings, her mother's silver hairbrush, the last valuable thing she owned. Samuel, she said, returning to the parlor, this is worth something, maybe enough to buy some of those cheap cattle come spring. He looked at the brush, understanding immediately what it meant to her. Clara, no, that's yours, from your old life. My old life is gone. This is my life now, our life. She pressed the brush into his hands. Let it help build our future instead of just reminding me of the past. Jake, who'd been pretending to read while listening to everything, suddenly stood up. I have something too. He ran upstairs and returned with a small leather pouch. My pa gave me this before he died. Said it was for emergencies. Inside were $20 gold, a fortune for a boy. A small but meaningful amount for their current crisis. Jake, that's your inheritance, Samuel protested. And I'm investing it in my family, Jake said firmly, sounding older than his years. That's what Pa would want. Samuel looked between his wife and son, emotion working across his weathered face. I don't deserve either of you. Too bad, Clara said lightly, though her eyes were wet. You're stuck with us. They pooled their resources, Clara's brush, Jake's gold, Samuel's savings, even the egg money Clara had been setting aside. It wasn't much, but with Morrison's offer of shared resources, it might be enough to get through winter and take advantage of the opportunities spring would bring. February brought a brief thaw, then more snow, then a thaw that lasted. The ranch became a muddy mess, but the moderating temperatures meant the remaining cattle could forage better. Samuel and Jake worked from dawn to dusk, repairing winter damage, tending to weak animals, preparing for calving season. Clara learned she was pregnant during the 3rd week of February. She'd suspected for a while, the nausea, the exhaustion, the tenderness, but when Mrs. Morrison confirmed it during a visit, the reality hit her like a physical blow. About 4 months along, I'd say, Mrs. Morrison pronounced after her examination. Due in summer, July maybe. Clara sat in stunned silence after Mrs. Morrison left. A baby. Samuel's baby. Growing inside her while they'd fought through blizzards and counted dead cattle and worried about survival. She was still sitting there when Samuel came in for lunch, muddy and exhausted from pulling a calf out of a bog. Clara? You all right? He knelt beside her chair, concern creasing his face. You're pale. Are you ill? Not ill. She took his muddy hand, placed it on her still flat stomach. Pregnant. The transformation of his face was something she would treasure forever, shock to understanding to joy so profound it remade him entirely. He pulled her into his arms, muddy clothes and all, holding her as if she were made of spun glass. A baby, he whispered against her hair. Our baby. Due in summer. July, Mrs. Morrison thinks. He pulled back to look at her face, his hands gentle on her cheeks. Are you happy? Terrified, she admitted. But yes, happy. Are you? Clara, you've given me everything. A partner, a son, and now. He shook his head, words failing him. But his kiss said everything necessary. Jake's reaction was more complicated. When they told him that evening, he went very still. A baby, he repeated. A real baby. Your actual child. Clara heard the fear beneath the words. Fear of being replaced, of losing his place in their makeshift family. Yes, she said carefully. Your brother or sister. But I'm not really. You are, really, Samuel interrupted firmly. You're our son, Jake. This baby will be your sibling. Blood doesn't change that. What if you love it more? The question burst out of Jake, raw and painful. It'll be yours, really yours, not just some orphan you took in. Clara moved to sit beside him, taking his hands. Jake, do you remember what I told you about losing my father? How I had nothing and no one? He nodded. You had nothing and no one too. That makes us the same, you and me. We both came to this ranch as orphans, in a way. Samuel chose us both, and we chose him and each other. This baby will be born into our family, but you and I, we built it. That's not less than blood, sweetheart. In some ways, it's more. Jake leaned against her, and she felt him trembling. You promise I'll still be yours. Forever, she said, as Samuel joined them, wrapping his arms around them both. No matter how many babies come, you were our first child, the one who made us a family. As winter gradually released its grip on the land, Clara watched her body change with wonder and some fear. Her clothes grew tight, her balance shifted, and the sickness that had plagued her early weeks gave way to an appetite that embarrassed her. I'm eating like a ranch hand, she complained to Samuel one morning, finishing her third helping of eggs. You're growing a person, he pointed out, his hand resting on the small bump now visible beneath her dress. That takes fuel. The ranch work didn't stop for her pregnancy. She modified what she could. No more heavy lifting, no more riding, but she still cooked, cleaned, tended the garden as it began to thaw, helped with the books. Samuel tried to convince her to rest more, but she refused. Women have been having babies while working since the beginning of time, she reminded him. I'm not made of glass. But privately, she was frightened. She'd heard the stories, women dying in childbirth, babies born wrong, the isolation of ranch life meaning no doctor could arrive in time if something went bad. Mrs. Morrison tried to reassure her, promising to be there when the time came, but Clara had seen too much loss to trust in promises. Spring arrived with a vengeance in April, the snow melting so fast the creek overflowed its banks. The mud was everywhere, tracked constantly into the house, despite her best efforts. But with spring came new life, calves dropping daily, the garden ready for planting, and news that several of the families who'd given up were selling their livestock cheap. Samuel took their pooled resources and bought 30 head of cattle from a departing family, animals that were thin but would recover with good grass. He also bought 2 horses, and to Clara's surprise, 6 sheep. Sheep? She questioned. I thought cattlemen hated sheep. Cattlemen are fools sometimes, he said. Sheep provide wool, meat, and they graze different grass than cattle. Diversification, Clara. Never put everything in one basket. Jake had taken to the sheep immediately, especially when one ewe produced twins that needed bottle feeding. He named them, against Samuel's advice, and carried them around like pets. He's going to be heartbroken when we have to sell them, Samuel warned. Maybe we don't sell those 2, Clara suggested. Maybe they become breeding stock. Samuel shook his head but smiled. You're both too soft for ranch life. Yet here we are, surviving it. By May, Clara was large enough that simple tasks became difficult. Bending to garden was impossible. Climbing stairs left her breathless, and she'd taken to napping in the afternoon, something that mortified her but which her body demanded. It was during one of these naps that trouble arrived. She woke to Jake shaking her shoulder, his face white with fear. Ma, there's men outside. 3 of them. Samuel told me to come get you, to stay with you. Clara struggled upright, her heart racing. Through the window, she could see Samuel in the yard facing 3 rough-looking riders. Even from a distance, she could see the tension in his shoulders. Get the rifle, she told Jake quietly. The one Samuel taught me with. Load it, but don't come outside unless I call for you. Jake nodded and ran for the gun while Clara made her way carefully downstairs and onto the porch. The men's voices became clearer. Told you before, Carter. This land should have been mine. Baxter promised it to me before he died. Baxter's widow sold it to me legal and proper, Samuel replied calmly. You have no claim here, Wallace. The man called Wallace spit tobacco juice near Samuel's feet. Legal don't mean right. You've done well here, Carter. Too well. Makes a man wonder if maybe you had help. Maybe you knew Baxter was dying, helped him along. Clara saw Samuel's hands flex, but he kept them away from his gun. That's a dangerous accusation to make without proof. Who needs proof? Wallace's hand drifted to his pistol. Sometimes justice finds its own way. Clara stepped onto the porch, making her presence known. The rifle Jake had brought was in her hands, not pointed at anyone, but clearly ready. Her pregnancy was obvious in her dress, and she saw the men register it. "Gentlemen," she said, her Boston accent sharp and clear, "I believe my husband has asked you to leave our property." Wallace laughed. "Got yourself a city woman, Carter? One who thinks she can handle a gun?" "I can handle it well enough," Clara said steadily. "And I'm not alone." She raised her voice slightly. "Jake, how many riders did you count coming down from the north pasture?" Jake, bless him, understood immediately. "4, Ma. Maybe 5. Morrison's men looked like." It was a lie, but Wallace didn't know that. He looked uncertain now, calculating odds. "This isn't over, Carter," he said finally. "You can't watch everything all the time. Accidents happen on ranches, fires start, cattle wander off. If anything happens to my property or my family," Samuel said, his voice deadly quiet, "I won't need proof to find justice, and neither will the other ranchers around here. We protect our own." Wallace and his men wheeled their horses and rode off, but Clara could see they'd be back. This kind of trouble didn't just go away. That night, Samuel held her close in bed, his hand protective over her belly. "You shouldn't have come outside. Could have been dangerous for you and the baby." "Everything about this life is dangerous," Clara pointed out, "but we face it together, remember?" He was quiet for a long moment. "I'm thinking of hiring hands, not just for the work, but for protection. Men who can shoot, who'll watch the property." "Can we afford it?" "Can't afford not to. Not with Wallace making threats and you about to have a baby." He kissed her forehead. "I won't let anything happen to you. Any of you." 2 days later, 2 men arrived at the ranch, brothers named Miguel and Carlos Hernandez, recommended by Morrison. They were quiet, competent, and unquestioningly loyal once hired. Samuel gave them the bunkhouse and put them to work immediately, but Clara noticed they always kept rifles close, and one of them was always watching the horizons. June brought oppressive heat and Clara's increasing discomfort. She could barely sleep, couldn't find a comfortable position, and the baby seemed to be constantly moving, pressing on organs in ways that made her gasp. "Like a little acrobat in there," she told Samuel one morning, his hand on her belly feeling the movement. "Strong," he said with satisfaction. "Like his mother." "Her mother," Clara corrected. "I think it's a girl." "Either way, as long as you're both healthy." The heat also brought tension. Wallace had been seen in town, talking to other malcontents, spreading rumors about Samuel. There'd been small incidents, a fence cut, some cattle driven onto Morrison's land, a small fire in the far pasture that Miguel had spotted and extinguished before it spread. "He's testing us," Samuel said grimly. "Seeing how we react, looking for weakness." Jake had taken to wearing his father's pistol, though Samuel insisted he not load it. The boy was protective of Clara, rarely leaving her alone, as if his presence could somehow guard against all threats. It was Jake who was with her when her water broke. It was July 3rd, the heat already oppressive despite the early hour. Clara was in the garden, trying to harvest vegetables before the sun became unbearable, when she felt the warm gush of fluid. "Jake?" she called, trying to keep her voice calm. "Go get your father. Tell him it's time." Jake took one look at her face and ran. Samuel arrived within minutes, Miguel with him. "Miguel, ride for Mrs. Morrison, fast as you can. Carlos, you're on watch. Nobody gets near this house who doesn't belong." Samuel swept Clara into his arms, carrying her inside despite her protests that she could walk. "I'm not invalid, just in labor," she said, then gasped as the first real contraction hit. "Humor me," he said, his face tight with worry. Labor was nothing like Clara had imagined. The pain was overwhelming, coming in waves that left her breathless and shaking. Samuel stayed with her, letting her grip his hands, wiping her face with cool cloths, murmuring encouragement when she said she couldn't do it. "You're the strongest woman I know," he said during a brief respite between contractions. You left everything behind, traveled across the country, learned to shoot, survived winter, stood up to Wallace. You can do this. Mrs. Morrison arrived after 4 hours, took one look at Clara, and started issuing orders. This baby's coming fast. Samuel, hot water. Jake, clean linens. Then both of you out. I'm staying, Samuel said firmly. Mrs. Morrison looked scandalized. Men don't. I'm staying, he repeated, and something in his tone ended the argument. Clara was grateful for his presence as the pain intensified. She'd never felt anything like this, waves of agony that seemed to split her in half. She screamed, not caring who heard, squeezed Samuel's hands until she was sure she'd break his fingers. I can see the head, Mrs. Morrison announced. One more push, Clara. One more. Clara pushed with everything she had left, felt something give way, and then heard the most beautiful sound in the world, a baby's cry. It's a girl, Mrs. Morrison said, placing the squalling, slippery infant on Clara's chest. A perfect little girl. Clara looked down at her daughter through tears, overwhelmed by the fierce love that consumed her instantly. The baby was red and wrinkled, with a shock of dark hair and Samuel's gray eyes. She's beautiful, Samuel whispered, his own eyes wet. Just like her mother. What will you call her? Mrs. Morrison asked, cleaning up with efficient movements. Clara looked at Samuel. They discussed names but hadn't decided. Now, looking at their daughter, she knew. Hope, she said. Hope Elizabeth Carter. Hope, Samuel repeated, touching the baby's tiny fist with one finger. Perfect. Jake was allowed in once Clara was cleaned up and settled. He approached cautiously, as if the baby might break if he breathed too hard. So small, he said in wonder. You can hold her, Clara offered. Just support her head. Jake sat carefully, and Clara placed Hope in his arms. The expression on his face, protective, amazed, already completely in love, told Clara that her fears about him feeling replaced had been groundless. I'm going to teach her everything, Jake declared. How to ride, how to shoot, how to read. Maybe let her learn to walk first, Samuel suggested, but he was smiling. That evening, as Clara dozed with Hope at her breast, and Samuel kept watch beside them, she heard Jake on the porch with Carlos and Miguel, telling them about his baby sister in a proud voice that carried clearly through the windows. She's got dark hair like Ma and gray eyes like Samuel. She's small, but Mrs. Morrison says she's strong. And when she grows up, I'm going to make sure nobody ever hurts her. Nobody ever makes her cry. She's going to be the safest, happiest little girl in all of Colorado. Clara felt Samuel's hand find hers in the darkening room. We did good, he said quietly. We did, she agreed, looking at their daughter, thinking of Jake outside standing guard, of the home they'd built, the love they'd found. We did very good. But even as she drifted towards sleep, content in the moment, she knew their challenges weren't over. Wallace was still out there. The ranch still struggled financially. The isolation and dangers of frontier life remained. But for tonight, with her family around her and her daughter in her arms, Clara allowed herself to simply be happy. The first weeks of Hope's life passed in a blur of feeding, changing, and marveling at every tiny expression and sound. Clara was exhausted but euphoric, amazed by this small person she and Samuel had created. Hope was a good baby, only crying when hungry or wet, content to lie in her cradle and watch the world with those serious gray eyes. Jake was completely smitten. He would rush through his chores to spend time with Hope, talking to her in a gentle voice about everything he saw and did. The chickens laid 12 eggs today, Hope. When you're bigger, I'll teach you how to gather them without getting pecked. And there's a new calf, all wobbly legs. You'll like the calves. Samuel was quieter in his devotion, but Clara would often find him standing over Hope's cradle in the early morning before his workday began, or holding her in the evening, his large hands impossibly gentle as he rocked her to sleep. It was during this peaceful time that Wallace struck. Clara woke one night to the smell of smoke. For a moment she thought it was the stove, but then Samuel was shaking her, his face grim in the moonlight. The barn's on fire. Stay inside with Hope. Jake's already up. He was gone before she could respond. Through the window, she could see orange flames licking at the barn's roof, hear the panicked sounds of horses and cattle. Miguel and Carlos were already fighting the fire, Samuel joining them, Jake running with buckets from the pump. Clara wanted to help, but Hope was crying, frightened by the commotion. She held her daughter, watching helplessly as the men fought to save the barn and the animals inside. It took hours, but they saved most of the structure and all the animals. As dawn broke, Samuel stood looking at the charred portion of the barn, his face black with soot, his hands burned from handling hot wood and metal. "This was no accident," Carlos said quietly. "I found tracks. 3 horses, coming from the west, leaving fast toward town." "Wallace," Samuel said, the name like a curse. "We have no proof," Clara pointed out, though she knew he was right. "Proof." Samuel spat the word. "Out here, we make our own proof." But before he could act on his anger, Morrison arrived with several other ranchers. Word of the fire had spread, and they'd come to help and to talk. "Wallace has been stirring up trouble all over the valley," Morrison said. "The Bakers lost 20 head of cattle last week. The Johnsons had their well poisoned. He's trying to drive us out, take over." "Then we stop him," Samuel said simply. "It's not that simple," another rancher, Thompson, said. "He's got friends, guns. And technically, he hasn't broken any laws we can prove." "Then we make him leave another way," Morrison suggested. "Buy him out. All of us together. Give him enough to go away and never come back." Samuel's pride rebelled visibly against the idea. "Pay him? After what he's done?" "It's that, or someone gets killed," Thompson said bluntly. "You've got a family now, Carter." "Is your pride worth risking them?" Clara saw the moment Samuel's anger transformed into something colder, more calculated. "How much?" They worked out the details over the next week. Every rancher contributed what they could, not much individually, but together, enough to make Wallace an offer he couldn't refuse. The message was clear: take the money and leave, or face the united opposition of every legitimate rancher in the valley. Wallace took the money. Clara watched from the porch as he rode away, his saddlebags heavy with gold, his face twisted with fury at being forced out. She didn't believe they'd seen the last of him, but for now, he was gone. The barn was rebuilt with the help of neighbors, everyone contributing labor and materials. It was exhausting work in the July heat, but it was also a confirmation of community, of belonging. These people had accepted Clara and Samuel as their own, worth protecting and supporting. Hope thrived through it all, gaining weight, becoming more alert. By August, she was smiling, and by September, laughing, a sound that could make even the hardest day bearable. Clara had worried about managing a baby along with her other duties, but she found a rhythm. Hope rode in a sling while Clara gardened, slept in a basket while she cooked, watched from her cradle while Clara and Jake did lessons. "She's learning too," Jake insisted when Samuel suggested the baby might be a distraction. "See how she watches? She's going to be the smartest baby in Colorado." The ranch slowly recovered from the winter losses and the fire. The cattle Samuel had bought cheap fattened on summer grass, the sheep produced good wool that Clara learned to spin, and the garden yielded enough to preserve for winter. They weren't rich, might never be, but they were surviving. One evening in October, as they celebrated Jake's 11th birthday with a cake Clara had managed despite Hope's interruptions, Samuel made an announcement. "I've been thinking about the future," he said, "about what we're building here. Jake, you're old enough now to understand business. How would you feel about becoming a legal partner in the ranch when you turn 18? Jake's fork clattered to his plate. "A partner? But I'm not. I mean, Hope is your real—" "You're our son," Samuel interrupted firmly. "Both you and Hope will inherit equally. But you're the one who will know the land, the work. Hope might marry, move away. But you, I think you'll stay. Am I right?" Jake nodded, unable to speak, and Clara saw him straighten, saw the boy becoming a young man with future and purpose. That night, as they prepared for bed, Clara asked, "What made you decide that? About Jake?" "Wallace," Samuel said surprisingly. "When he threatened us, Jake didn't run. He stood guard, protected you and Hope. He's proven himself, and—" He paused. "I want him to know he's not just someone we took in. He's family, with all the rights and responsibilities that means." "You're a good man, Samuel Carter." "I'm a lucky man," he corrected, pulling her close. "I have you, Jake. Hope. I have land that's recovering, neighbors who support us. A year ago, I was alone in this house, wondering what the point of it all was. Now I know. As autumn progressed toward winter, Claire reflected on the journey that had brought her here. 13 months ago, she'd stepped off a stagecoach, terrified and desperate. Now she stood on her own land, her daughter in her arms, watching her husband and son work together to prepare for the coming cold. The challenges hadn't ended. Money was still tight, winter still threatened, the isolation still pressed close on dark nights. But she no longer faced these things with desperation. She faced them with determination, with partnership, with love. Mrs. Morrison visited the next week, bringing news from town and admiring how Hope had grown. As she prepared to leave, she took Clara's hands. "You've done well here," she said simply. "Not every woman could have adapted like you have. Samuel chose wisely." "We chose each other," Clara corrected. "That made all the difference." Winter came gentler that year, as if nature itself had decided the Carter Ranch had endured enough hardship. The first snows were light, allowing Samuel and Jake to move the cattle without the desperate urgency of the previous year. Clara watched from the kitchen window, Hope balanced on her hip, as her husband and son worked in practice synchronization, their movements speaking of shared understanding built through seasons of labor. Hope at 6 months old was a source of constant wonder. She had Samuel's gray eyes, but Clara's dark hair, which stuck up in amusing tufts no matter how Clara tried to smooth it down. She was crawling now, exploring every corner of the house with determined curiosity, Jake following anxiously behind to ensure she didn't hurt herself. "She's going to eat a spider," Jake warned one morning, diving to extract something from Hope's chubby fist. "Why does she put everything in her mouth?" "That's how babies learn about the world," Clara explained, rescuing a particularly ugly beetle from Hope's grasp. "You probably did the same thing." "I doubt I was ever that troublesome," Jake said with the dignity of his 11 years, making Clara hide a smile. The economic situation had improved slightly with the sale of wool and several steers, enough that Samuel had surprised Clara with a luxury she hadn't dared hope for, a small piano, shipped from Denver at considerable expense. It sat in the parlor now, its polished surface gleaming in the lamplight, a tangible symbol of dreams reclaimed. "Play something," Samuel requested one evening after supper, Hope drowsing in his arms while Jake worked on his letters at the table. Clara's fingers found the keys hesitantly at first. It had been so long since she'd played, her hands stiff and uncertain. But muscle memory returned, and soon Chopin's notes filled the small house, transforming it into something more than just walls and roof. She played from memory. All her sheet music had been sold in Boston, but the melodies lived in her bones. When she finished, she turned to find Samuel's eyes wet with unshed tears. "That was beautiful," he said simply. "Worth every penny." The peace of that winter evening was shattered 3 days later when Carlos rode in hard from town, his horse lathered with sweat despite the cold. Samuel met him in the yard, Clara watching from the doorway. "Trouble, boss," Carlos said without preamble. "Wallace is back. He's in town, drunk, talking about unfinished business." Samuel's face went granite hard. "I thought we'd seen the last of him. He gambled away the money we gave him. Lost it all in Denver. Now he's back, saying the deal was made under duress, that the ranch is rightfully his." Carlos paused. "He's got new men with him. Hired guns from the look of them." That night, Samuel sat cleaning his rifle with methodical precision while Clara tried to maintain normalcy for Jake's sake. But the boy wasn't fooled. "Wallace is back, isn't he?" Jake said quietly after Hope was asleep. "I heard Carlos." Samuel looked up from his weapon. "Yes, but this is our land, legally bought and paid for. We'll protect what's ours." "I can help," Jake offered, trying to sound older than his years. "I'm a good shot now." "Your job," Samuel said firmly, "is to protect your mother and sister if anything happens to me. Can you do that?" Jake nodded solemnly, and Clara felt her heart constrict at the weight being placed on such young shoulders. This was the price of frontier life, children forced to become adults before their time, facing dangers that would have been unimaginable in her Boston childhood. The attack came 2 nights later, but not as they'd expected. Clara woke to Hope's crying, unusual for her good-natured daughter. As she lifted the baby from her cradle, she smelled it. Kerosene. Someone had doused the porch with it. "Samuel!" Her scream brought him running, Jake behind him. Through the window, they could see figures in the yard, one holding a torch. "Wallace, you coward!" Samuel shouted through the door. "Face me like a man, not a snake in the darkness." Wallace's laugh carried clearly through the cold air. "Come out then, Carter. Let's settle this once and for all." "It's a trap," Clara whispered urgently. "Don't go." But Samuel was already checking his pistol. "If I don't face him now, he'll never stop. He'll burn us out, hurt you, hurt the children." He cupped her face in his hands. "I have to end this." He kissed her, hard and desperate, then turned to Jake. "Remember what I said. You protect them." Then he was gone, striding into the yard where Wallace waited with 3 other men. Clara watched from the window, hope clutched against her chest, Jake beside her with the rifle ready. The confrontation was brief but seemed to last forever. Words were exchanged, too low to hear clearly. Then Wallace went for his gun. Samuel was faster, his shot true, and Wallace crumpled to the ground. His men hesitated, and in that moment of uncertainty, Miguel and Carlos appeared from the shadows, rifles trained on them. "Your boss is dead," Samuel said clearly. "You can join him, or you can ride away and never come back. Choose." They chose to ride. Samuel stood over Wallace's body for a long moment, then turned back to the house. Clara met him at the door, pulling him inside, checking frantically for wounds. "I'm all right," he assured her. "It's over." He's gone. But the cost of that violent night went beyond Wallace's death. Word spread that Samuel Carter had killed a man, and while everyone agreed it was justified, it changed how people looked at him. Some with increased respect, others with new wariness. Clara saw how it weighed on him, this taking of life, even in defense of family. "I never wanted to be that kind of man," he told her one night, staring into the fire. "The kind who solves problems with bullets." "You're not," Clara said firmly. "You're the kind of man who protects what he loves. There's a difference." Christmas came with less fanfare than the previous year, the shadow of violence still hanging over them. But Jake worked hard to bring cheer, cutting a small tree, making paper decorations with Hope watching from her high chair. The baby was eating solid food now, making spectacular messes that had Jake in stitches. "She's got more on her face than in her belly," he laughed, trying to spoon mashed carrots into Hope's mouth while she grabbed for the spoon. "Let her try herself," Clara suggested, handing Hope the spoon. The resulting chaos had them all laughing, even Samuel, the darkness lifting momentarily from his eyes. On Christmas Eve, they attended church in town. Clara was nervous about their reception, but the congregation welcomed them warmly. Reverend Mitchell even mentioned them in his sermon, talking about the courage to defend one's family and the strength to build community in a harsh land. After the service, Mrs. Hollowell pulled Clara aside. "You've been through the fire now," she said. "Literally and figuratively. This land tests everyone, but you've proven you belong here." That validation from the woman who'd first sheltered her meant more to Clara than she could express. January brought news that would change their lives again. Morrison approached Samuel about a business proposition, a partnership to drive cattle to the railhead in Kansas come spring. It would mean Samuel being gone for 2 months, but the profit could secure their future. "It's dangerous," Samuel said that night, discussing it with Clara. "Indians, rustlers, weather, and leaving you alone here with the children." "We wouldn't be alone," Clara pointed out. "Miguel and Carlos would be here, and the other ranchers' wives manage when their husbands are gone. This is different. I'd be gone longer. And after Wallace." "Wallace is dead," Clara said firmly. "Samuel, this could mean real security. Money for Jake's education, a dowry for Hope someday, expansion of the ranch. Can we afford not to take the chance?" He studied her face. "When did you become so brave?" "The day I stepped off that stagecoach," she replied. "I just didn't know it yet." The preparation for the cattle drive consumed the rest of winter. Samuel worked with Morrison to gather the herd, 500 head between them, along with horses and supply wagons. They hired drovers, tough men who knew the trail, planned the route, arranged for supplies. Clara learned to handle more of the ranch operations, understanding that she'd need to manage everything in Samuel's absence. Jake stepped up too, taking on more responsibility with the animals, learning to make decisions rather than just follow orders. You're the man of the house while I'm gone, Samuel told him seriously. That's not just words. You'll need to help your mother with real decisions, real problems. Jake nodded, the weight of it visible on his young face. I won't let you down. The night before Samuel's departure, Clara couldn't sleep. She found herself memorizing everything about him, the way he breathed, the warmth of his body, the calluses on his hands. 2 months had never seemed so long. I'll write when I can, he promised. Send letters from the towns we pass. Just come back, Clara whispered. That's all I ask. He pulled her closer. I'll always come back to you. You're my home, Clara. You and Jake and Hope. You're what all of this is for. The morning of departure was chaotic. 500 cattle don't move easily, and the noise was tremendous. Hope cried at the commotion, and Clara saw Jake fighting tears as he helped Samuel with final preparations. Samuel kissed Hope's head, ruffled Jake's hair with instructions to take care of the women, then pulled Clara into a long embrace. 2 months, he said. Maybe less if all goes well. We'll be here, Clara promised. We'll be waiting. She stood with Jake and Hope, watching the herd move out, Samuel at the lead with Morrison, until they were just dust on the horizon. Then she turned back to the ranch, her ranch to run, her family to protect, her life to manage. Well, she said to Jake, who was trying to look stalwart despite his obvious sadness, I suppose we'd better get to work. The first week without Samuel was the hardest. Every sound at night made Clara reach for the empty space beside her. Every decision felt monumental without him to consult. But gradually, she found her rhythm. She rose before dawn to check the animals with Jake, managed the ledgers Samuel had left, directed Miguel and Carlos in their work. Hope took her first steps during the second week, toddling between Clara and Jake with delighted squeals. Clara wished desperately that Samuel could see it, could share the joy of their daughter's milestone. We'll tell him everything when he gets back, Jake promised, catching Hope as she almost fell. Every single thing she does. A letter arrived after 3 weeks, posted from a town in Kansas. Samuel's handwriting was cramped but clear. My dearest Clara, the drive goes well. We've lost only a few head to river crossing. The weather holds fair. Morrison sends his regards. I miss you more than words can say. Kiss the children for me. How is Hope? Is Jake managing his responsibilities? I lie awake at night under these vast stars and think of you. 2 months seemed reasonable when planning. Now each day feels like a year. All my love, Samuel. Clara read it so many times the paper grew soft. She wrote back immediately, telling him about Hope's steps, Jake's successful delivery of a breached calf, the early vegetables in the garden. She tried to pour her love into words, knowing they were inadequate but needing to try. The 4th week brought trouble. A late spring storm hit with unexpected fury, and one of the ranch buildings, an old shed Samuel had been meaning to repair, collapsed under the weight of snow. Worse, several cattle had been inside. Clara worked alongside Miguel, Carlos, and Jake through the night to save what animals they could. By morning, they were exhausted, but had lost only 2. Samuel would be proud, Miguel said, watching Clara tend to an injured calf with gentle efficiency. You're a true rancher's wife now. Clara realized with surprise that he was right. Sometime in the past year, she'd transformed from a desperate Boston refugee into someone who belonged here, who could face whatever this land threw at her. May arrived with wildflowers and warming weather. Hope was walking confidently now, following Jake everywhere he'd led her. The boy was endlessly patient with his little sister, teaching her words, showing her bugs and flowers, carrying her when her small legs tired. Clara was in the garden one afternoon, Hope playing in the dirt nearby while Jake worked on his letters, when she heard horses. Many horses. Her heart leapt. The drive wasn't due back for 2 more weeks, but maybe... She ran to the yard, Hope on her hip, Jake beside her. But it wasn't the returning drive. It was a group of cavalry soldiers, their uniforms dusty from travel. The lieutenant dismounted, removing his hat. Mrs. Carter? I'm Lieutenant Brooks. We're looking for Samuel Carter. Clara's blood went cold. He's not here. He's on a cattle drive to Kansas. Why? What's happened? The lieutenant looked uncomfortable. There's been Indian trouble along the trail. Several drives have been attacked. We're trying to warn all the outfits. Clara gripped Hope tighter, feeling Jake's hand slip into hers. How bad? Some casualties, ma'am. Lost cattle. We don't have specific information about your husband's drive, but they would have been in the affected area about a week ago. After the soldiers left, Clara stood frozen in the yard. Jake tugged at her hand. He's all right, isn't he? Samuel's smart. He's careful. He's all right. Clara looked down at Jake's frightened face, at Hope's innocent confusion, and found strength she didn't know she possessed. Yes, she said firmly. He's all right. We would know if he wasn't. We would feel it. But the next week passed with no word, and Clara's certainty wavered. She went through the motions of daily life, but her heart was constantly racing, her ears straining for the sound of horses. Jake grew quiet, spending long hours standing watch, as if he could will Samuel to appear on the horizon. It was Hope who heard them first, her babbling suddenly excited as she pointed toward the road. Clara ran outside to see dust in the distance, and then, like a prayer answered, the herd came into view. She searched frantically for Samuel's familiar figure and nearly collapsed with relief when she saw him, dusty and thin but whole, riding toward home. He dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, catching Clara as she flew into his arms, Hope between them, Jake crashing into them both. For a long moment they just held each other, a family reunited, no words necessary. When Samuel finally pulled back, his eyes were wet. We were attacked, he said quietly. Lost some men, lost some cattle, but we fought them off, got through, made it to the railhead, sold for good prices. He touched each of their faces as if confirming they were real. All I could think about was getting back to you. That night, after Hope was asleep and Jake had finally been persuaded to go to bed, Samuel told Clara the full story. The attack had been sudden and fierce. 2 drovers had been killed, Morrison wounded but survived. They'd lost nearly 100 head but saved the rest, pushing hard to reach safety. I've never been so scared, he admitted. Not of dying, but of leaving you alone, leaving the children without a father. But you didn't, Clara said, holding him tight. You came home. I'll always come home, he promised. Though I think my days of cattle drives are over. The profit was good. We're secure now, Clara. We can build, expand, send Jake to school if he wants. But I'm not leaving again. Not for that long. The money from the drive did indeed secure their future. Samuel paid off the remaining debt on the ranch, purchased more land from a departing neighbor, and put money aside for the children's futures. But more than financial security, the separation had proven something to both of them. They were stronger together than apart, and no amount of money was worth the risk of losing what they'd built. As summer progressed, the ranch thrived. The garden produced abundantly, preserved by Clara for the winter ahead. Hope grew more adventurous daily, a constant source of both delight and anxiety as she explored her expanding world. Jake grew taller, his voice beginning to crack, caught between boyhood and manhood. One evening in August, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Hope asleep in Clara's arms and Jake whittling beside them, Samuel said quietly, I've been thinking about our story. How unlikely it all is. A desperate woman from Boston, a lonely rancher, an orphaned boy, a baby born into uncertainty. We shouldn't work, all of us together. But we do. We do, Clara agreed, thinking of all the moments that had brought them here. The fear, the joy, the struggles, the victories. We're choosing each other every day. That's what makes it work. Jake looked up from his whittling. Are we going to have more babies? Clara and Samuel exchanged glances, and she felt herself blush. They'd been careful since Hope's birth, wanting to wait until things were stable. But now... Maybe, Samuel said, his hand finding Clara's. Would you like that, Jake? I guess, Jake said with studied casualness. Hope needs someone to boss around besides me. They laughed, and in that laughter was everything. Love, hope, family, future. The challenges weren't over. They never would be. Not out here where nature and circumstance could change everything in a moment. But they would face whatever came together, this unlikely family forged from loss and chance and choice. As darkness fell and they moved inside, Clara paused at the door to look back at the land, their land. In the distance, she could see the lights of other ranches, other families fighting their own battles, building their own dreams. But this piece of earth, this house, these people, this was hers. Coming? Samuel asked from inside, Hope beginning to fuss for her evening feeding. Coming, Clara said, turning away from the vast darkness toward the warm light of home. The autumn brought news that Colorado was moving toward statehood, bringing changes that would affect them all. The railroad was coming closer, which would mean easier transport for cattle, but also more people, more development. Samuel was both excited and wary of the changes. Progress is necessary, he said one evening, reviewing plans for a new barn, but I hope it doesn't change us too much. I like our valley the way it is. Clara, bouncing Hope on her knee while the child babbled happily, understood his concern. The isolation that had once frightened her had become precious. Their own world where they made the rules, where their unlikely family made perfect sense. The first frost of October reminded Clara that she was pregnant again. She'd suspected for weeks, but hadn't wanted to say anything until she was certain. Now, watching her breath cloud in the morning air as she collected eggs, she placed a hand on her still flat stomach and smiled. This child, unlike Hope, would be born into security and certainty, with a father who wouldn't have to leave for dangerous cattle drives and a family already complete in its love. She told Samuel that evening after the children were asleep. He was working on the ledgers, calculating the profits from their best harvest yet, when she placed a cup of coffee beside him and said simply, "We're going to have another baby." The pen dropped from his fingers, and he turned to her with wonder spreading across his weathered face. Truly, truly. Spring, I think. April or May. He pulled her onto his lap, his hands gentle on her waist. How do you feel? Happy, she said, and meant it. This time feels different. We're not struggling to survive. We have help with Miguel and Carlos. Jake's old enough to truly help, and Hope. She smiled, thinking of their determined toddler. Hope will be a wonderful big sister. Samuel kissed her tenderly. I love you, Clara Carter. Have I told you that today? Only twice, she teased. You're falling behind. The news brought different reactions from Jake and Hope. Jake, now 12 and trying hard to be mature, nodded sagely and said, Good. The ranch needs more hands. But Clara caught him smiling to himself later, whittling what looked suspiciously like a toy horse. Hope, at barely 18 months, didn't understand the concept, but patted Clara's stomach when prompted and said, Baby! In her clear, high voice that made everyone laugh. Winter came early that year, but they were ready for it. The new barn Samuel had built with the cattle drive money was solid and warm, protecting their expanded herd. The root cellar was full of preserved vegetables, canned goods, and smoked meats. They had enough firewood to heat 3 houses, Jake having spent the autumn splitting logs with determined efficiency. It was during the first blizzard of December that unexpected visitors arrived. Clara was teaching Jake geometry while Hope napped when she heard the dogs barking. Through the snow-blurred window, she could make out a wagon struggling through the drifts. Samuel and Miguel went out to help, returning with a family Clara had never seen before. A man, woman, and 3 children, all blue with cold and clearly desperate. Found them stuck about a mile up the road, Samuel explained, ushering them toward the fire. Their wagon broke an axle. The man who introduced himself as Thomas Brennan was pathetically grateful. We're heading to California, but the storm caught us. We thought we could make it to town. In this weather, you'd have died trying, Samuel said bluntly. He looked at Clara, a question in his eyes. Of course you'll stay, Clara said immediately, already moving to heat soup and gather blankets. Jake, help me make up beds. Hope, no, sweetheart, let the children warm up first. The Brennans stayed for a week while the storm raged and Samuel and Thomas repaired the wagon. Their children, 2 boys and a girl ranging from 5 to 10, filled the house with chaos that delighted Hope and gave Jake someone besides his baby sister to supervise. Martha Brennan was a thin, tired woman who looked older than her probable 30 years. She watched Clara manage the household with something like awe. You make it look easy, she said one afternoon, helping Clara with the endless laundry that 5 extra people created. The frontier life. You seem born to it. Clara laughed, telling her about arriving from Boston just 2 years ago, knowing nothing about ranch life. I was terrified, she admitted, but Samuel was patient, and Jake helped, and somehow we figured it out together. Your husband, he's unusual, Martha observed. Most men wouldn't have stopped for strangers in a storm. He's the best man I know, Clara said simply. The Brennan children were fascinated by everything about the ranch. The oldest boy, Timothy, followed Jake everywhere, hero worship clear in his eyes. The middle boy, James, was gentle with hope, playing endless games of peekaboo. The girl, Sarah, attached herself to Clara, helping with cooking and asking countless questions about everything. Why did you leave Boston? Sarah asked one evening as Clara taught her to knead bread. Sometimes life pushes you toward something better, even when you don't know it at the time, Clara answered, thinking of all the pain that had led to this joy. Thomas Brennan was a dreamer, full of plans for California gold and orange groves. Samuel listened politely, but Clara could see his skepticism. After dinner one night, when the children were asleep, Thomas asked Samuel's advice about the journey ahead. Wait until spring, Samuel said firmly. Your family won't survive the mountains in winter. Find work in town, save money, prepare properly. But the opportunities in California will still be there in spring. Your children won't be if you push on now. It was harsh but true, and Clara saw Martha's relief when Thomas finally agreed. When the storm broke, Samuel and the hands helped them to town, where Thomas found work at the general store and they rented rooms from Mrs. Hollowell. Thank you, Martha whispered to Clara before they left. Not just for the shelter, but for showing me that a woman can be strong out here, that a family can thrive. Christmas was quiet after the chaos of the Brennans' visit. Clara's pregnancy was showing now, and she tired more easily. Hope had become protective of her mother, patting Clara's belly and saying gentle in a serious voice that made them all smile. Jake had grown several inches, and his voice had fully changed, occasionally cracking in moments of excitement, but mostly settling into a deeper register that startled Clara every time she heard it. He'd taken to reading Samuel's agricultural journals, discussing crop rotation and breeding programs with a sophistication that belied his 12 years. He's got a mind for this, Samuel told Clara one night as they watched Jake help Hope build a tower of blocks, patiently rebuilding each time she knocked it down. He could go to college, study agriculture properly, make this ranch something beyond what I could imagine. Do you want that for him? I want him to have choices. Real choices. Not just taking what life forces on him. Clara understood. They'd both been forced by circumstances, her by poverty and scandal, him by heartbreak and isolation. Jake deserved better. In January, a letter arrived that would test their family in unexpected ways. It was from Boston, from Margaret, Clara's only remaining friend from her old life. Clara's hands shook as she read, Dearest Clara, I hope this letter finds you well in your frontier life. I write with news that may upset you, but I felt you should know. Your father's former partner, Mr. Whitley, has died. In his final illness, he confessed to framing your father for the embezzlement. He acted alone, driven by gambling debts. Your father was innocent. The authorities have cleared his name posthumously. There's even talk of some restitution, though the lawyers say it will take time. I thought you should know that your father died an innocent man. Your friend always, Margaret. Clara sank into a chair, the letter crumpling in her grip. Samuel found her there an hour later, tears streaming down her face. Clara? Is it the baby? Are you hurt? She wordlessly handed him the letter. He read it, then knelt beside her chair, gathering her hands in his. He was innocent, she whispered. All that shame, all that suffering. He killed himself for nothing. Not for nothing, Samuel said gently. His death brought you here. To us. I'm sorry for your pain, truly, but I can't be sorry for the path that brought you to me. That evening, Clara told Jake the truth about her past. The wealth, the scandal, her father's suicide, all of it. She'd kept it vague before, but now he was old enough to understand. Jake listened solemnly, then said, So you could have been rich? Lived in a big house with servants? Yes. But then you wouldn't be my mother. No, I wouldn't. He considered this. Then I'm glad things happened how they did. Is that wrong? Clara hugged him fiercely. No, sweetheart. That's not wrong at all. February brought a surprise visitor. Clara was struggling to carry water, her pregnancy making her clumsy, when a well-dressed woman appeared in the yard. She was perhaps 40, elegant even in traveling clothes, with gray eyes that looked familiar. "You must be Clara," the woman said. "I'm Elizabeth, Samuel's former fiancée." Clara nearly dropped the water bucket. What are you doing here?" "May I come in? I promise, no harm. I needed to see." Against her better judgment, Clara invited her in. Elizabeth looked around the homey kitchen at Hope playing with wooden animals Jake had carved, at the evidence of a lived-in, loved-in life. "He's happy," Elizabeth said, not quite a question. "Yes." "And you love him?" "With everything I have." Elizabeth nodded slowly. "I made the right choice then." "Oh, not in how I did it. That was cruel. But Samuel, he deserved someone who could match his capacity for love. I couldn't. I loved his brother, but it was a selfish love. Samuel deserves better." "Why are you really here?" Clara asked, her hand protective over her pregnant belly. "Closure, I suppose. And to give you this," Elizabeth pulled out a small leather pouch. "Samuel's mother's ring. He left it behind when he went west. I thought it belongs with his real family." Clara took the pouch with trembling fingers. Inside was a simple gold band with a small ruby, worn smooth with age. "Thank you," she managed. Elizabeth stood to leave, then paused. "Is he kind to you? Patient?" "He's everything." "Good. That's good." Elizabeth moved toward the door, then turned back. "The children, they're beautiful. You're beautiful. This life suits you in a way it never would have suited me. Tell Samuel, Seth. Tell him I'm sorry and that I'm glad." She left before Samuel returned from the fields. Clara debated telling him about the visit, but secrets had no place in their marriage. That night, she showed him his mother's ring. His face went through a series of expressions: shock, old pain, then something like peace. "She kept it all these years?" "She wanted you to have it. Said it belongs with your real family." Samuel took the ring, studied it, then slipped it onto Clara's finger above her wedding band. "It does." March arrived with unexpected warmth, melting snow and turning the ranch into a muddy mess. Hope, now walking confidently and talking in full sentences, delighted in the mud, requiring constant vigilance to keep her from eating it. "Why do children want to eat dirt?" Jake complained, carrying a mud-covered Hope at arm's length toward the house. "It's how they learn," Clara laughed, though she was equally exasperated. Her pregnancy made bending difficult, and Hope seemed determined to find every mud puddle in Colorado. The baby was active, constantly moving, keeping Clara awake at night. Samuel would place his hand on her belly, feeling the movements with wonder that hadn't diminished since Hope. "This one's a fighter," he said one night as a particularly strong kick made Clara gasp. "Like his mother." "Her mother," Clara corrected, though she secretly thought this baby felt different from Hope, stronger, more insistent. "Do you really care?" Samuel asked. "Boy or girl?" "No, I just want healthy, and for it to be over. I'm so tired of being pregnant." He rubbed her back and she leaned into his strength. 2 years ago she'd been alone, desperate, with nothing. Now she was surrounded by love, growing another life, secure in ways she'd never imagined possible. The last weeks of pregnancy passed slowly. Clara could barely move, relying increasingly on Jake and even little Hope to help with household tasks. Hope appointed herself Clara's helper, bringing her things, not always the right things, and patting her mother's belly while saying, "Baby, come out." Jake took over much of the cooking, producing meals that were edible if not inspired. Samuel tried to help when he could, but spring was the busiest time on a ranch, calving, planting, repairs from winter damage. It was April 10th, a beautiful spring morning with wildflowers beginning to bloom, when Clara's water broke. This time, she was ready. Mrs. Morrison had been staying at the ranch for the past week, anticipating the birth. Jake knew to keep Hope occupied. Samuel knew to stay despite convention. This labor was faster but no less painful. Clara gripped Samuel's hands, pushing with everything she had while Mrs. Morrison coached her through it. Hope's cries from downstairs, where Jake was trying to distract her, added to the chaos. "One more push," Mrs. Morrison commanded. "The baby's almost here." Clara pushed, feeling the same tearing, releasing sensation she remembered from Hope's birth. Then a cry, strong and angry and perfect. "It's a boy," Mrs. Morrison announced, placing the squalling infant on Clara's chest. "A big, healthy boy." Clara looked down at her son through tears of exhaustion and joy. He was bigger than Hope had been, with a shock of light hair like Samuel's and a face already showing stubborn determination. "A son," Samuel breathed, touching the baby's head with shaking fingers. "We have a son." They named him William Thomas Carter. William for Samuel's father, Thomas for Clara's. Jake was enchanted with his little brother, while Hope seemed puzzled by this new, loud addition to the family. "Baby Loud," she pronounced, covering her ears when William cried. "Yes," Clara agreed, trying to nurse William while Hope climbed onto her lap. "Baby is very loud." As spring turned to summer, their family settled into new rhythms. William was a demanding baby, wanting constant feeding, fighting sleep, protesting everything with impressive volume. Hope responded by becoming incredibly independent, insisting on doing everything by self. Jake divided his time between ranch work and helping with his siblings, showing a patience that amazed Clara. One evening in June, as Clara sat on the porch nursing William while Hope played with dolls and Jake read aloud from one of Samuel's books, she realized this was the life she'd never known she wanted. Not the Boston society life she'd been raised for, not the desperate survival she'd expected when answering Samuel's advertisement, but this messy, chaotic, perfect life. Samuel joined them, sitting beside her, his arm around her shoulders. "Content?" he asked quietly. "More than content," she answered. "Complete." July brought scorching heat and news that Colorado would officially become a state the following year. The railroad had reached the nearest big town, only a day's ride away. Change was coming whether they wanted it or not. "We need to be ready," Samuel said one evening, studying maps with Jake. "The railroad means we can ship cattle easier, but it also means more competition. We need to think bigger." "What about horses?" Jake suggested. "The cavalry's always needing horses, and with more people coming west..." Samuel looked at his son, for that's what Jake was, in every way that mattered, with pride. "That's good thinking. We could start small, see how it goes." Clara listened while nursing William, Hope asleep against her side. This was her family planning for the future, building something that would last generations. The desperate woman who'd stepped off that stagecoach 3 years ago wouldn't recognize this life, this confidence, this belonging. August 15th marked 3 years since Clara's arrival in Copper Creek. Samuel surprised her with a celebration, inviting their neighbors for a party. Mrs. Hollowell made a cake, Morrison brought his fiddle, and the ranch filled with music and laughter. "A toast," Samuel said as the sun set, painting the mountains gold. "To my wife, who came here with nothing but courage and gave us everything: love, family, hope." "To Clara!" The crowd cheered, and Clara felt tears prick her eyes. Later, as they cleaned up, Jake carrying a sleepy Hope inside while Clara settled William, Samuel pulled her aside. "I have something for you." He handed her an envelope, looking uncharacteristically nervous. Inside was a deed, not to the ranch, which was already in both their names, but to a piece of land in town where a small house sat. "I don't understand," Clara said. "It's for Jake. For when he's older, if he wants to go to college or start his own business. He'll always have a place that's his that can't be taken away. And the rental income in the meantime will pay for his education." Clara threw her arms around him, overwhelmed. "You're giving him a future." "We're giving him a choice," Samuel corrected, "the way you gave me a choice when you agreed to be my wife." That night, after the children were asleep, Hope in her little bed, William in his cradle, Jake in his room that was getting too small for his growing frame, Clara and Samuel stood on the porch looking at their land. "Do you ever think about how unlikely this is?" Clara asked. "All of it?" "Every day," Samuel admitted. "A mail-order bride who became my heart, an orphan boy who became our son, 2 babies who completed our family. It shouldn't have worked, but it did, because we chose it. Every day, through every challenge, we chose each other. September brought the harvest, the best they'd ever had. The garden produced abundantly, the cattle were fat and healthy, and the small herd of horses Jake had helped start was already showing promise. They hired extra hands for the harvest, and Clara found herself managing a kitchen that fed a dozen men 3 times a day. Hope had become her assistant, standing on a chair to help cook, though she was more hindrance than help. But her chatter and enthusiasm made the work lighter. William, now 5 months old, had finally settled into a routine, content to watch the chaos from his high chair, babbling commentary no one understood. One afternoon, as Clara was preserving peaches with Hope helping and William gnawing on a hard biscuit, Jake burst into the kitchen. "Ma! Come quick! There's a lady at the door and she says she's from Boston and she knows you." Clara's heart stopped. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked to the front door, Hope trailing behind. Standing there, looking completely out of place in silk and lace, was Margaret. "Clara!" Margaret exclaimed, then stopped, taking in Clara's simple dress, flour-dusted apron, the children clinging to her skirts. "Oh, my dear, you look wonderful." They embraced, and Clara felt the past and present collide. Here was her last link to her old life, standing in the doorway of her new one. "Margaret, what are you doing here?" "I came to see you. To bring news. The restitution came through. Your father's estate has been partially restored. There's money, Clara. Not a fortune, but enough to leave here if you wanted." Clara felt Jake stiffen beside her, saw Hope's confused face. From his cradle in the kitchen, William began to cry. "Come in," Clara said, her mind spinning. "Come in and meet my family." Margaret stayed for 3 days, and in that time, Clara watched her old friend try to understand her new life. Margaret was polite to Samuel, but clearly puzzled by Clara's choice. She was charmed by the children, but horrified by the amount of work required to maintain the household. "You could hire help with the money," Margaret suggested on the second evening. "Or you could come back to Boston. The scandal is over, your father's name is cleared. You could have your old life back." Clara looked around the parlor, at Samuel reading to Hope, Jake whittling while listening, William sleeping in his cradle. She thought of Boston society, the endless social calls, the restrictions, the emptiness of it all. "This is my life," she said simply. "This is my family. I'm not leaving." Margaret left the next day, pressing a bank draft into Clara's hands. "For the children's education," she said. "Your father would want that." After she left, Clara found Samuel in the barn, unusually quiet. "Were you tempted?" he asked without looking at her. "To go back?" Clara pulled him to face her. "Never. Not for a single second. Samuel Carter, you're stuck with me forever." Relief washed over his face. "Good. Because I don't think I could survive losing you." "You won't have to." October arrived with spectacular color, the aspens turning gold across the mountains. Hope was 3 now, talking constantly, her personality emerging as strong-willed and sunny. William was crawling, pulling himself up on furniture, clearly eager to follow his siblings. Jake, at 13, was nearly as tall as Clara and showing signs of becoming a handsome young man. Girls in town had started noticing him, much to his embarrassment and Hope's amusement. "Jakey has a sweetheart," Hope sang one day after a trip to town where the Morrison girl had blushed and giggled at Jake. "I do not," Jake protested, his face red. She's just a girl." "You're getting old enough to think about such things," Samuel said mildly, hiding a smile. "In a few years—" "Can we please not talk about this?" Jake begged, and they took mercy on him. But Clara noticed he'd started paying more attention to his appearance, combing his hair carefully before town trips. Her little boy was growing up. The letter from Jake's aunt came in November, unexpected and unsettling. She was coming to visit, wanting to see how Jake was doing. Jake was terrified she'd want to take him back. "She can't, can she?" he asked Clara anxiously. "I mean, you and Samuel are my parents now. The ranch is my home. She can't just take me." "We won't let anyone take you," Clara promised, though she was worried too. Legally, Jake's aunt had rights they didn't. She arrived the day before Thanksgiving, a small, neat woman who looked nothing like Jake. She was younger than Clara had expected, perhaps 30, with tired eyes and work-worn hands. "You must be Clara," she said. "I'm Ruth. Thank you for taking care of my nephew." Over the next days, Ruth observed their family life quietly. She watched Jake work with Samuel, saw him teach Hope her letters, helped Clara with William. She said little, but Clara could see her processing everything. Finally, on her last evening, Ruth asked to speak with Clara and Samuel privately. "I came here thinking I should take Jake back," she admitted. "Family should be with family." But, she paused, choosing words carefully. "He's happy here. Happier than I could make him. I work in a factory 12 hours a day. I live in a boarding house with barely room for myself. What could I offer him compared to this?" "We love him," Clara said simply. "He's our son in every way that matters." Ruth nodded. "I can see that. I'd like to be part of his life if I could. Letters, maybe visits, but this is his home. You're his parents. I won't interfere with that." The relief was overwhelming. Jake, when told, hugged his aunt fiercely, then hugged Clara and Samuel even harder. "I want you to visit," he told Ruth. "You're my family too. But this is where I belong." Christmas that year was perfect in its imperfection. William had learned to walk and was into everything. Hope insisted on helping with everything, resulting in more messes than assistance. Jake had made presents for everyone in secret: a new bridle for Samuel, hair combs for Clara, a carved horse for Hope, rattles for William. "When did you find time?" Clara asked, admiring the delicate work on the combs. "Nighttime, in the barn," Jake admitted. Miguel helped with the tools. Samuel's gift to Clara was unexpected, a photograph, the first they'd ever had taken. He'd arranged it during their last town trip without her knowing. There they all were, frozen in time. Samuel standing tall and proud, Clara beside him with William in her arms, Jake trying to look serious, Hope grinning widely. "For posterity," Samuel said. "So our grandchildren will know where they came from." "Grandchildren," Clara repeated, laughing. "Let's let these children grow up first." But she treasured the photograph, this proof of their unlikely family's existence. As 1877 ended and 1878 began, Clara stood once again on the porch, watching the snow fall. But this time, she wasn't alone. Samuel's arms were around her, Hope and William asleep inside, Jake reading by the fire. 3.5 years, she said quietly. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday I stepped off that stage. Sometimes it feels like a lifetime." "It has been a lifetime," Samuel said, "just compressed into a few years. We've had more joy and sorrow, more growth and change than some people experience in decades." "No regrets?" "How could I regret anything that brought me you?" "Brought me our children? This life?" Clara turned in his arms to face him. "I love you, Samuel Carter. Thank you for giving me time to choose you. Thank you for choosing me." As they went inside, closing the door against the cold, Clara thought about the woman she'd been. Desperate, alone, expecting nothing. That woman couldn't have imagined this life, this love, this family born not from expectation, but from choice, patience, and the courage to reach for happiness despite fear. The house was warm, filled with the sounds of family, Jake's quiet reading, the children's peaceful breathing, the fire crackling in the hearth. This was home, truly home, in a way nowhere had ever been before. And as Clara settled into her rocking chair with Samuel's hand in hers, she knew that whatever challenges tomorrow brought, they would face them as they had everything else. Together, with love, without conditions.